Keith, thank you so much for joining me again. As we were just chatting, you were one of my first guests, and it was such an honor to have you. And you've really influenced my career and me joining this field. So it's such a great pleasure to have you back.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to have played that sort of role. It's a great podcast. Pleasure to be involved with it.
I've been curious to know how life has been since we last spoke, because it's 2021. It's been such a long time. Anything you'd like to share before we begin the deep philosophical dissection?
Well, life keeps happening. Quite a lot of things have happened since it's just at the end of the pandemic, I think, that we talked first. And so coming out of that, life seems to have speeded up rather, or maybe it's just that I've slowed down. So the children are growing up. Maria, my partner, is doing lots of interesting things. She's currently has a fellowship from Yale's Life Worth Living network to explore what it is that makes for a flourishing life. I'm not sure if she's going to tell me, but she's working on that, which is a very interesting project. And she's focusing in particular on how you live a flourishing life in a world that's increasingly dominated by intelligent technology. And I think this is something that we're all going to have to think a lot about. I suppose that's the biggest change that's happened in those 3 years, is this sudden well, I was going to say emergence, but it has been coming for some time, but it's suddenly burst into public awareness, the possibilities of deep learning, obviously through things like ChatGPT, and the potential benefits and risks and threats that this poses. And this is something that philosophers have suddenly I like to say that this is the philosopher's moment. This is the moment when we're suddenly needed, because who can advise society about how to think about these things, about the ethics of them, and about the, if you like, the metaphysics, or at least the psychology of these things. Do LLMs have? Are they actually communicating with us? Do they have beliefs? Are they performing intentional actions when they communicate, when they respond to us? Are they actually replying to our questions? Are they assisting us, advising us, informing us? It looks as if they are. We're tempted to think of them that way, as if they're being helpful and so on. But is that just an illusion? I tend to think it is. And what are the dangers of having things that seem so like cooperative partners, but maybe aren't? So it seems to me this is the moment maybe when philosophers are finally in public demand. Whether we can rise to the occasion, I don't know. But there's a debate here, I think, that everybody needs to be involved in. It was one thing that another thing that has happened recently, of course, that my intellectual hero, my friend, Dennett, has died earlier this year, and I know this was something that was exercising him very much. During the past few years, he was devoting most of his time to thinking about this, about the risk. He was always looking forward, and it's difficult to say that it's the most urgent problem that we're facing. We're facing so many of them, from climate change to political instability to war and so on, but it's certainly one of the mix of big challenges that are facing us. So that's certainly something that's happened in the world, and I suppose I'm trying in my little way to respond to it too.
There's two things you brought up there that I'd like to touch on. One is, are you familiar with the work by Eric Schwitzgebel?
I am, yes, indeed. Yeah.
I mean, because he talks about a lot the ethics of ethicists, or the philosophy of philosophers, and whether we are actually important for for these topics of discussion. Because I think he found that if you take a group of ethicists together and give them certain philosophical or ethical dilemmas, that tend to do pretty much the same as the average person, which is fascinating work.
Yes, it's up. I say this flippantly, though. There may be a serious point with it. If someone had to make an ethical decision that would affect me, affect my life, perhaps, who would I prefer to make it? A trained ethicist, philosopher, ethicist, or just somebody who had had a lot of experience of life and just lived a rich and nice, ordinary person, if you like, with a lot of experience? Or would I prefer someone who'd really thought through all the principles of it? Now, it may be, and perhaps some ethicists would say this, that the two would tend to converge. I don't know, but I think I would go for the ordinary person, the nice, ordinary person.
Yeah.
It's a sort of Spock versus McCoy, I suppose, situation. But
yeah, it's exactly where he sort of headed with that thought, I think, is that you can sort of, you don't need that academic training to sort of have the wisdom involved with making those decisions.
But I suppose in defense of ethicists, they might say, well, that's not really what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to probe some of the principles behind ethical thinking. Yeah. We're not claiming to be great yes. Ethical people. We're trying to think about some of the principles behind ethical thinking, principles which the ordinary person might have internalized and be intuitively following. We're trying to make them explicit, trying to find the rationale behind it. It's not enough just to say, oh, well, trust so-and-so, they're a wonderfully wise and person. We want to know, we like to think there's some rational basis to our decisions. And even if the person can't articulate it themselves, we feel there should be some rational basis for their decisions. And I suppose ethicists might say that's what we're trying to unpick and uncover. So maybe Eric's being a little hard on them. Physician heal themselves, it's the doctors who smoke most and live the unhealthy have unhealthy lifestyles.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I know that for sure, because I know there's times where I'm telling patients to sleep well, exercise, diet, while I'm working like a 30-something hour shift. The irony is incredibly apparent. But then on top of that, the second thing I wanted to ask you was about Dan Dennett. He's right behind you. There's a beautiful picture of him.
You see the picture? Yes, yeah. That was in Crete, yes, 3 years ago.
And he sort of touched on this, giving us those intuition pumps in order to make us have the tools to make decisions that are better, more informed. And yeah, it's such a great loss. As I said, you were one of those people when I was writing my dissertation, and obviously Dan. The two of you combined, and then we worked on that together. You assisted me. Since we last spoke, we've had a great loss. Anything you want to say about Dan?
I wrote a little piece just after he died, which perhaps we could link to for the Institute of Art and Ideas. There's so much I could say, and it's interesting that people who knew Dan, I think we all had each of us felt we had a very special relationship with him. He was a wonderful person, a wonderful human being, as well as a great philosopher. When it came to academic battles, he didn't take any prisoners. He could be, if he thought somebody was, there's a section in his autobiography on academic bullies, in which he certainly doesn't pull any punches. But towards younger people, towards people who he felt would benefit from his help and advice, he was wonderfully supportive and a wonderful friend. I think that's what I miss more than, he's always been my intellectual hero, but in the way that Dennett is there in the work, and I can go back and revisit Dennettian ideas, Dennettian themes. He's left these with us, and so we can continue to engage with that. It's the person that I miss more than anything. Though of course the two were inseparable, and I think that's something I've been saying about him, that I just made a separation between Dennett the philosopher and Dennett the man, but you can't, and that's the point. That's why he was such a good philosopher. I think that all of his activities, he was deeply engaged with life. I mean, he was a farmer, he was a sailor. He enjoyed good company, good conversation. He enjoyed. He was a musician. He was a sculptor. He considered becoming a professional sculptor. He was deeply engaged with life in all its richness. And that's what made him such a good philosopher, because he had a huge context in which to see things. I mean, I repeat this every time. It's a thing that he often repeated, the line from Wilfrid Sellars, that the aim of the philosopher is to see how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, to see the big picture, to see the pattern in the noise, if you like. And I think he did that better. This is a bold statement, better perhaps than any human being has ever done. That's a very bold statement. Of course, he had a huge inheritance to draw on. He was born at a particular, he was the first to stress this, he was born at a time when there was a confluence, I think, of work in philosophy, in emerging cognitive science, computing theory, neo-Darwinism, work in evolutionary biology. And there was a confluence of all of this really exciting and revolutionary work, and he was able to synthesize it in a way, I think, synthesize it in a way that perhaps no one else had been able to do, and communicate it. He was a great communicator. So I think I would say that he achieved Sellars' aim better than anyone has done to date, and we're all in his debt. And what he would want us to do is to continue that journey, that exploration. I would sometimes say to him that I'd found myself saying things or writing things that I thought were my ideas, and then I'd reread something from perhaps that he'd written 40 years ago and found that it anticipated there. And he was never displeased by that. He was always delighted by that. He said that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to feed into the stream of thinking about things, and it was the ideas that mattered and the continuation of the ideas. So I think the best tribute to him is to continue in that spirit, which doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with everything he said. Of course, he wouldn't want that either. But I think he saw the pattern more clearly than anyone's done.
I have to say that when I first started doing this, he was probably the person who got me into this. Like, just genuinely one of the most iconic, prolific thinkers that I could think of when I was a kid, just growing up reading his stuff. And we chatted via email quite a few times. He always signed up with that DCD. And we planned to have a podcast together, and it never came to fruition. And it's so sad for me, because I wish we got to chat. I mean, I never got the opportunity to really pick his brain. I don't think if I ever told you this, but I almost considered calling this podcast Quine and Qualia.
Oh, wow. Great title.
Yeah, I would have lost quite a few non-illusionist listeners and viewers with that title.
I can understand why people disagree with Dan. What I can't understand is why some people dismiss his work. That I can't understand. If you think Quine and Qualia is a paper that can be dismissed quickly, then go and read it again, and then read it again, and then read it again. Dan's work is deceptive in some ways. It's easy to read. You don't have to struggle too much to read it, because he's a clear writer. And it's easy to think you've got the measure of the arguments. Well, he's just said that, and so on. That's I don't agree. Now, it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that you've fully grasped the argument and that you've seen through it. Every time I read Quine and Qualia, I think I see something new, and it's something I'm not fully appreciated. Maybe if he'd written in a more obscure style, in a more and made the reader work harder to get through the paper, it would have forced them to think a little harder. about what he was saying, but he did them the favor of writing easily. But don't think that that means you can understand easily. You need to really reflect on these, on the intuition pumps that he uses there. They bear thinking about, almost in a. You see, what he's asking us to do is, he's not presenting your standard sort of bit of analytic philosophy where he analyzes some bit of language, or he presents some organized deductive argument with premises and formally valid, and then he defends the premise. He's not doing that kind of thing. He's asking you to look at things from a different angle, to try on a different pair of spectacles, if you like, or to move to a different location to look at the landscape. That's a bit more of a Riley metaphor, maybe. Say, come over here, climb up this hill and see how the landscape looks from this perspective. And he can tell you what to do. He can set out the examples, the intuition pumps, the things that he's using to try to get you to take that view. But then it's up to you to take the view and to look at the landscape from that perspective. You can come to the point he's suggesting, you can climb up with him, but if you don't look at the landscape and explore how it looks from that perspective and how the things, the relations between things appear different from there. If you just stand there and sort of stubbornly look the other way or something, I'm overextending this metaphor, then you won't get the benefit of it. So it's in that way, it's maybe more like something like a Zen exercise that requires. You don't. Okay, use a Wittgensteinian, but if you're in the grip of one picture, you don't get to appreciate another picture just by, it's not a matter of flicking a switch. You have to work yourself into it. Work yourself out of the old way of thinking first, and then into the new way of thinking. And I think this is something perhaps that people, they see that he's asking them to give up an old way of thinking, say about free will or consciousness or intentionality, whatever. They see he's asking them to give up that. And they think, well, okay, I've got that. He doesn't think we should think of it that way. So I'm lost. So that means I don't have free will, I don't have consciousness, and all the foundations have gone. Oh God, that can't be right. So I must stick with where I want. But he's never doing that. He's never saying, give up that and just be a sort of nihilist. No, he's saying there's another way that does all the work that one did and some more too. That's a better way. And you've got to take that second part of the journey and get into the framework, the picture that he's offering, the alternative, certainly on free will. How can he say he's a realist about free will, given that he's asked you to give up this sort of view of what free will of what free will is? Well, work your way into it, and you'll see. So,
yeah, I think some of the dismissive aspects of or people's views on Dennett in general stem from the fact that he obviously was one of the four horsemen who came at religion with so much vigor and life that many people just associate him with that only, and they purely dismiss any philosophical argument because of that. And people tend to do that quite often. I often think about Richard Dawkins and his amazing work with the selfish gene, and then now that's complete. Nobody cares because once he wrote The God Delusion, people have completely dismissed such brilliant ideas that came before that. And that's quite a bad habit. And I think Dennett has fallen into the same trap because his philosophical work, his science, he's a cognitive scientist as well. He's immersed himself. He was one of the first people to bring the sciences, the neurosciences, into this philosophical sphere. It reminds me of Patricia Churchland and the way they did this neurophilosophy, and they were these people who brought this together for us, and we cannot take that for granted.
Absolutely. I think that it's one thing I've not talked much about when I talk about Dan, it's about the horseman thing. I think from things that I've heard Dan say, he did that as a piece more of public service than as something that he was deeply passionate about. I mean, yes, I mean, understanding religion as a natural phenomenon is a very interesting task for cognitive science, indeed, psychology, cultural theory, and so it's an interesting task. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But I think he thought that I don't think he was as hostile to religion, or certainly to religious attitudes, instincts, as some of the others were. I think he had a lot of sympathy for many of the attitudes that would find expression in religion. He said a beautiful thing on a podcast, I can't remember which one it was. Oh no, not an interview anyway. He said that there was many valuable things about religion that we should take care not to lose when we lose the dogmatic forms of religion that are causing that can cause so much harm. And one of them, he said, was the idea that religion is like a religious community is like a family. It's a place where when you go, they have to take you in. And that unconditional acceptance and forgiveness and so on. So in many ways, he valued the attitudes that find expression, some of the attitudes that find expression, not some of the more dogmatic ones. He valued some of the attitudes that find expression in religion. But he also thought there was a lot of harm done by religion. The people were exploited and persecuted, and a lot of division caused by religion. And of course, he was thinking, I suppose, from an American perspective, where there was certainly, I won't go into this, but certainly some forms of religion that seem quite exploitative. So I think he thought of that as a piece of public service that he was doing, and which actually distracted him from the things that he really wanted to be doing.
And it was, I think it was also because the fact that these four guys had written these books around the same period, it just sort of clumped together as like a cult in themselves, this new age atheist.
Yes.
But what you're talking about is very clear, because it's true that unlike the others who were not professional philosophers, he had this ability to do that and break away from it in a successful manner, whereas the others had this almost anti-religious anger towards it, and I think he was sort of different in that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree. I don't. I
mean, look, he definitely was anti-religion, but I don't think it was to the extreme that the others were.
Absolutely. I mean, he was insistent that I think one thing that, I mean, there was that piece he wrote after he had his serious when he had his 2006, and he had an aortic dissection and very nearly died. And he wrote a wonderful piece, almost on, I think he wrote it from his hospital bed, called "Thank Goodness." He asked people not to thank God for preserving him, for saving him, but to thank the goodness of the people who had been involved in doing it. And again, I think this reflected his practical approach to life in general. There were lots of people to thank, lots of people who had worked really hard, both the people who had done the research behind the techniques that were used and the people who had actually been there implementing those techniques, and the people who'd come and brought him food and washed him and looked after him. All of these people had played a huge practical role in saving him, and those are the people we should thank. And in society, those are the people we should thank, the people who keep things running and who preserve us, who preserve our way of life, our happiness. Those are the people we should thank, not some intangible being whose role in all this is totally mysterious. And so it was, I think there was a sort of indignation at people ignoring the true sources of goodness and the true sources of meaning in our life. Again, he wasn't wanting to take away the it's another illustration of what I was saying, that he said, don't thank God, don't thank some abstract being from another realm of existence. But it wasn't saying don't thank anyone. Don't have gratitude. Yes, have lots of gratitude, but have it to the right targets. So the emotion that people are expressing through, oh, thank God, that's fine, but direct it to the right target. Yes. And I think that's I guess that's how he would have wanted to, at least his attitude to the best in religion would be, let's preserve it, but set it in a better framework.
Yeah, it was more about breaking that spell, similar to the consciousness spell. I mean, let's head to that while we're here. One of his famous quotes, I think it was in my essay as well. Dennett's quote was, "Consciousness is an illusion of the brain, for the brain, by the brain." And I know in one of your papers you said Yeah, if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, just let me know. You say that if it's an illusion to think consciousness is an illusion, then you are not disillusioned.
Yes, I did say yes.
Has that held true since we last spoke?
Yes, yes. Well, I'm always in with the caveat that it's a certain conception of consciousness that we're talking about. I'm not saying that we're not conscious in any sense, obviously. We're not unconscious, we're not in a coma, we're awake and we're perceiving things and we're aware of things and we're vividly aware of the world around us and of our own bodily condition. And of course we are. Yes, I'm not suggesting for a moment that people that our ordinary talk of seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting, being in pain, feeling pleasure and so on doesn't capture anything. Of course it does. It captures one of the most essential things about it. I'm just denying a certain picture of what that is, which says that it involves immediate acquaintance with mysterious mental qualities that are somehow produced by the brain. Now,
maybe Keith, define it, because you're not saying consciousness is an illusion. You are saying a concept of your perception or thought or idea of consciousness is actually the illusory issue.
I'm saying that there's something that happens when we attend to our own experience, when we think about our own experience, that induces us to adopt a certain picture of what it is to be conscious that is deeply misleading.
Yes.
And that there's something about this, when I say we attend to our own experience, I could use the word introspect, when we sort of look inwards, or we pay attention to how it is with us right now, what it's like to be us, if you like to use a phrase. There's something about what happens then. And what does happen then is a very, very interesting question for cognitive science that produces this, if you like, this, or tends to induce us to endorse this view of ourselves and the nature of our experience that I think is deeply flawed and misleading, and we could call an illusion, because there is this deep tendency for us to endorse this view. It's not that this view is one that it may be that you don't endorse the view until it's presented to you by a philosopher, perhaps. It has to be articulated, but once it is articulated, it gets a great grip on us. And I think there's something about the nature of introspection itself that makes us susceptible to this picture, even if we don't pre-theoretically articulate, even if we don't articulate it to ourselves until we get to do some philosophy. Sorry, that was a little confused. So the picture is that there's if you like, an irreducibly, what I call an irreducibly subjective world. There's that my being conscious involves there coming into existence a world that is just for me. Okay? That that is somehow distinct from the world that we share. There's the shared world with all the things in it that we can all communicate about and point to and identify and agree on the features of. But then there's this private world, which is how that outer world is, as it were, rendered and presented to me internally. What the outer world feels like for me, where me here is a bit unclear, because it's almost like there's an inner me that is, it's not just the physical me, but there's a sort of inner me aware of this inner world, which is how the outer world is rendered for this inner me. So there's this irreducible subjective world, and no one can know what that world is like. They can guess it from their similarity to me, from the things I say, the organism, from my behavior, from my attempts to describe it and so on. They can speculate about it and guess that it's probably like their own to a large extent, but they can never actually detect it. There's no way neuroscientist or any form of cognitive scientist can examine this world, can directly detect its properties. And it's a mystery how the physical brain produces it. Some people may think it's not physical at all, that it's an immaterial soul. Others think that it's something that the physical brain produces, but that is more than just the activity of the brain. It's some creation of the brain, and its relation to what the brain is doing is very mysterious. This is the hard problem. How does the physical public brain, the objective brain, in fact, produce this subjective world. And now I think there's something right about that picture. The brain is doing something that involves representing the world and creating a perspective on it, but it's not creating this radically separate realm of reality. That's the illusion. It's the way we think about what the brain is actually doing, which is, again, it's like the Dennett thing, we shouldn't think of, it's not wrong to talk about us as having a subjective perspective on the world. It's just wrong to conceptualize it in this inflated way as a separate realm of reality. So we need to remove that picture, but then replace it with another picture of subjectivity that is less metaphysically inflated and that is more tractable, and that we can begin to understand and theorize and gradually unpick using the tools of cognitive science, and thereby integrate ourselves more with the shared world, so that we're not separate from it, but part of it.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's when I listen to it, I often think I know exactly what you're trying to say. People are really just not listening to what you're saying. You know, they're not taking it in. Similar to what we were talking about with Dennett's paper on qualia. They're reading, dismissing it, but not really understanding exactly where you're trying to come at it. And I think the first time we spoke for about 3 hours, and if nobody really understood, I think they should really go back and watch that, because we went into quite a lot of detail. We spoke about the ethics, the ethical implications, how some of my work, I also helped defend a little bit of it. And there's so much backtracking. I feel your pain. I don't even know what else to say, except I feel your pain. Because when I try to speak about it with colleagues, or if I try and have the conversation with other philosophers or professors on this channel, I see immediately the misunderstanding. And it's difficult because I sometimes don't want to play devil's advocate too much, and I also don't want to defend someone else's view too much. So I find myself just letting them have that misunderstanding, because this podcast is not about me having an argument or a debate with people. It's to let them explore their ideas. So that's what this episode's about. While we're talking about these misunderstandings, let's Robert Kuhn just released that paper, the landscape of consciousness. I think it's a perfect time to talk about this, because this would be your way to sort of give us examples of where people's illusions are coming from, or where their illusory opinions of their version of consciousness might be. He broke it out into monisms, idealisms, panpsychisms. He referenced you as well. At some point, there's many points where he actually referenced you and cited your work. Anything you want to say about that paper first before we begin? I'm going to chat to Robert in about a month or so.
Oh, fantastic. To be honest, I've only skimmed it so far, so I will need to. I'm going to read it again much more carefully. And so I won't. 5,000
words, Keith. It's crazy. It's 175,000 words. It's crazy.
It's rather long. It is. But so I won't start digging into that, because there's so much there. And let me just say two things. One thing, I think I'm convinced of this, that whether or not the sort of view that I have, you have, and Dan had is right, it's a view that's worth articulating and offering to people for their consideration. And I think once people do consider it carefully and comprehendingly, I think they will find it attractive. But there's a bigger, now this is what you were saying, there's a big communication problem. I think I've got the picture. But as you saw just then, I was struggling somewhat to articulate it.
Yes.
Okay. And I was qualifying it partly because I'm aware of the things that people will say. So I'm trying to say something that is fairly bold and clear to put across the structure of the view, but at the same time being careful trying not to make it too bold so that I overstep and deny something that I don't want to deny. It's more a matter of a reconceptualization of things. So it's not as much a denial as saying, again, as I said before, like free will or whatever it might be, it's not saying it doesn't exist, it's saying it's not what you think it is. But trying to get this, and it's a change of perspective. And if I can get people into the right position to look at it, they will see for themselves what I'm trying to say.
Do you think that maybe you should have considered Nicholas Humphrey's slight twist of the word, I mean, into phenomenal surrealism? Because I think that might have been a good move now in hindsight.
I think that's good, and I think it's a useful part of the technique. I worry though that
you wanted magicism, eh, or magicalism?
I originally did, because I like this idea that, again, this quotation from Lee Seagal, a writer on magic that Dan used so often, with the distinction between real magic and magic that is actually real. Real magic being the magic that wizards and people in stories do, in fairy tales do, and magic that can actually be done, the sort of magic that Penn and Teller do. So I would like to say that consciousness is magic, not in the first sense, but in the second sense. It's a very, very clever trick. And the point about these, they both have the same effects, really. They both create the same effects on us, on the observer. Whether it was done by real magic or done by Penn and Teller magic, it still looks like there's some body floating in midair, say. Okay, and the power of nature, of evolutionary processes, to craft the stage magic type of magic, and to convince us that things are, that there's real magic in the fairy tale way occurring. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of nature to craft those kind of magical effects for its own ends, which is exactly what Nick talks about in Soul Dust, which is some subtitle is The Magic of Consciousness. So he did initially like this notion of magic and illusion, but his worry, and I share this worry, because his worry, I think, is that the magical effect, the effect that we use phenomenal talk to describe, is something very real, and it expresses something very important. This is the thing for Nick. When we talk about what it's like, we're expressing something very important. We're expressing how things affect us, their significance for us, how we react to them. He talks about it's not the perception of red, but reading. The sensation of red is our response to a certain kind of stimulus, to red stimuli. It's our take on those things. It's what it's the significance that red things have for us. And I completely agree with this. And it's something I'm trying to develop in my current work. And so, if you like, when we talk about what experience is like, we're talking about how it impacts on us, how it affects us, what the complex multidimensional significance that it has for us. And I was going to say we experience the experience, but we're aware of this, if you like, as a sort of condensed essence of significance. Okay, so we encounter the world as packed with significance, because what it's doing, the shared world is bombarding us with stimuli. We are reacting to those stimuli in multiple different dimensions, cognitive, emotional, physiological, all sorts of different dimensions. Many of these reactions are not actually overt. They're just sort of subtle changes in our expectations, in our tendencies, priming us to respond to the next round of stimuli. And I think we have a sense, and this is what introspection gives us, a sense of how that unfolding reaction, this complex multidimensional reaction, of how it is unfolding at each moment. And that's what we're gesturing at when we talk about what the experience is like. We have a sense of the condensed significance of the stimulus for us. Nothing here that's essentially private. It's all due to mechanisms of sensitivity and reactivity and monitoring of those mechanisms. But it doesn't come to us in that way. It comes to us as a sense of, this is what that stimulus means for me. And that meaning, that expressive, that expression of our response, that's perfectly real. Okay, so when this reading, that is perfectly real. That response is real. And this is why Nick doesn't like to talk about illusion, because he thinks the stuff that I'm describing as the talk that I construe as referring, let me say this again, think about the function that talk about what it's like, about phenomenal consciousness. Think about the function of the talk. Now, he agrees with me, I think, that, and with Dan, that the function of that talk isn't to track mysterious mental property qualities that are directly presented to us. That he will agree is an illusion, but he thinks it's tracking something else. This expressive, the significance of stimuli for us. It's expressing that significance. It has an expressive function rather than a descriptive function. It's saying what this means for me, and that is perfectly real because it does mean that for me, and that's why he doesn't like to talk of it as an illusion. And I agree with him that in that sense it's not an illusion.
Have you read Sentience, Keith?
I have, yes, and which applies this framework. I need to reread that, which applies this framework to the questions about the distribution of consciousness in the natural world, and suggests that there's an important distinction between cold-blooded and warm-blooded creatures.
Yes,
yeah, Nick is full of wonderful ideas.
Dan actually gave that book very high praise.
Yes,
that was Nick's the closest he's ever gotten to giving a perfect definition of consciousness in his opinion.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I strongly recommend it.
It's very good. I enjoyed it.
I've said some. I think I said some nice things about it as well in print. But the illusion talk isn't addressed to those people, as it were, to the people that Nick's addressing. It's addressed to the people who want to take, want to construe phenomenal language in a different way, and build metaphysical edifices around upon the basis of phenomenal realism. And I think those people are chasing an illusion.
Okay, well,
and it's important to say that it's important to be quite robust about that. We have to get rid of the false pictures. So Nick is focusing, I think, on building the positive picture. I'm focusing more. The illusion talk certainly is designed more to get people to drop the bad picture. But I see them as complementary for that reason.
I think, okay, so let's do this, Keith. Let's try and frame this a little better so people understand. There is the illusion problem, of course, which we have to address. But there's two things I want to bring up. One was you've been working on what's known as the reactivity schema theory, which I think we should definitely cover at some point. Or unless you would like to do that first, and then like sort of build our way up.
Whichever way you want to do it. How are you going to continue there?
I think, look, let's address the illusion problem. Oh, sorry. The second thing that I wanted to ask you about was the last time we spoke, 2021, you said you were going to write a book, Descartes Prison. Do you remember that? Is that still something? Is that still something in the making, or?
It absolutely is, but I've
title. Have you decided on a new?
I think I might. That's the sort of working title, but it's something I was going to say to you in relation to this problem of getting people to see the view for what it is. I've continued to write more or less technical pieces for journals and collections of papers about illusionism. And the reason I've held off trying to write the popular book is that I want to build up a sufficient mass of techniques for presenting the view accessibly. I don't think there's much point in writing a view that presents it in a way that only other philosophers who were sympathetic to the position, or at least willing to take the time to unpick it, would appreciate. I want to write it in a way that really presents it accessibly and attractively to a wide audience.
Yes.
I mean, Dan made a pretty good job of, doing this in Consciousness Explained, I think, but it needs continually redoing. And so I've held off thinking, I want to get myself not just clearer about the details of the position, but also clear about how best to present the position. This is one reason why I like doing podcasts and why I like chatting on Twitter and so on, is what I'm doing each time is trying out different ways of presenting it and seeing which ones work. And I feel I'm building up a sort of portfolio of ideas, which I can then use. But I want to try, I like to think that I can write fairly engagingly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I want to do. I don't want to just write a book that other philosophers will read and we'll get a few positive and a few negative reviews, and then we'll go onto the shelves.
Yes.
I want to try to put this in. So Descartes Prison. It's a little unfair to Descartes, actually, because there's ways of construing what Descartes was doing in the Meditations that are much more that don't there's a tradition of using Descartes in a certain way. I mean, they talk of the Cartesian theatre and so on, which may be a little unfair to what he was trying to do. There's a matter of dispute exactly what he was trying to do. But it may be that this use of him as a whipping boy, as it were, is a bit unfair to the historical Descartes. But there's certainly a popular Descartes.
Yeah, I thought you might have been playing a little bit of a back and forth with your buddy Philip, because I know, I mean, obviously Galileo's era is playing homage to
Descartes. That was the point. Yeah, that was the point.
And that's another thing that's happened since then. You guys have Mind Chat. Do you think that's changed anything regarding your views over time? I'll put a link to the podcast as well.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to talk to the guests. I mean,
it's fun. Hey, it's one of those. It really does open your eyes to many alternate ways of thinking.
We've been trying to make them shorter and more accessible, but I kind of like the early ones where we just rambled on for 3 hours talking to someone. And
I prefer long.
I enjoyed those. We would just sit and talk to whoever it might be, David Papineau or whatever, for 3 hours. And,
I'm chatting to David. I'm chatting to David next week.
Oh, fantastic! Yes, he's always great to talk to. And
materialist or physicalist as you can get. That's
sorry.
He's as materialist or physicalist as you can get.
Oh yes. I mean, he doesn't like the term illusionism, but whenever I talk to him, we seem to end up on a very similar page. So I think I suspect the differences are more in presentation and
anything you would like me to ask him, Keith, clarify for you.
I can't go anything off the top of my head, but if I do, I'll let you know.
Let me know.
So yes, the popular book, but I want to do it right. That's the point. I don't want to waste an opportunity to do that. Maybe I'm just putting it off, but so I thought, I'll for instance, I've just published a paper on the ethical implications of illusionism, in which I look at some worries that people have, particularly some concerns raised by my fellow illusionist François Kammerer, who is a committed illusionist, but thinks that illusionism might force some revisions to our ethical, because I don't think that it does. In fact, I think that insofar as it does invite ethical revisions, they're entirely benign, positive ones that involve expanding our circle of ethical concern. But I wanted to get these worked out in detail for myself before I tried to put them, and also to find the metaphors. I mean, I keep playing around with metaphors. The rainbow is the one that I've been using recently. Well, a little while now. It's are rainbows illusions? Well, it depends what you mean by rainbow. If you mean a certain sort of atmospheric effect created by a low sun in a moisture-laden atmosphere, the effect that it creates on a perceiver standing at a certain, with their back to the sun, well, that's perfectly real. I mean, you can take a photograph of it. If you mean an actual colored arc at a certain spatial location in the sky, moving down to meet the ground at a certain position, no, there's no such thing. If you go there, you won't find a rainbow. So I kind of like that. It's that rainbows are real, but they're not what you might naively think they are, like arcs in the heaven. And so I kind of like that one, because it means that you can robustly say, consciousness is real, like a rainbow is real, but don't expect to find it in the brain in the way that you would, just any more than you would expect to find a rainbow at the particular location in the sky. Don't go looking for the pot of gold at the end of it. It's like looking for the neural correlates.
You also need to really define, people also need to realize that the word illusion needs to be defined correctly as well. And they
Yes,
misunderstand. That is a
yes,
big.
of course, of course. It's a provocative, but of course, a lot of people say, "Oh, that an illusion is itself a conscious state. So consciousness can't be an illusion." Goodness sake, yourself contradicting yourself. Well, of course, um, sure, illusions are experiences, but I treat them. The illusionist treats them like all other experiences, as states that don't themselves have phenomenal properties. So we can perfectly well explain how phenomenality could be illusion, provided the illusion itself is not defined in phenomenal terms. So that's a bit of a red herring. But I think any word, I wanted to use magicism, I mean surrealism too, which Nick uses, which I do like.
Surreal,
But
yeah.
I'm sure that has
or Michael's caricature.
Caricature, yes. I mean, all of these are gesturing at the same idea, that it's not what you think it is, that it's in some way distorted, exaggerated, in a way that leads us to form certain. It's Nick's view, it would be like looking at one of Picasso's painting and expecting to find people with distorted faces and arms and things.
Yes. I think François will do a good job at also assisting you with building up that database that will allow you to eventually write the book you want, because he is very actively involved with this. And you gave me his email address and allowed us to have the chat. I'll put a link to that for everyone who's watching.
François is great. He's doing this. He's doing sort of David Chalmers of illusionism. I like to think, in that he's doing this careful taxonomy of positions and options, which David is so good at. I guess I'm more. Well, I'm not uninterested. I certainly am, and I always enjoy reading François' work to see how he's analyzing the logical space, if you like, here or mapping the logical space.
When you guys did the Illusionism as a theory of consciousness, your paper, the one that you had edited and got put together, I didn't realize how young François was at the time. He was actually very.
He just finished his PhD, but he's a fantastic philosopher. Yeah. And we wrote a paper together last year on, in fact, doing this very thing, taxonomizing logical possibilities for introspective systems. And François himself is working on a book on illusionism, which will, I think, be a really important contribution to I mean, again to exploring the landscape of possibilities here, which is much richer, I think, than some people think. Much richer, and of course he has his own particular path through that landscape, but it's been relatively underexplored. So in the way in which people have been exploring, say, panpsychism over the past few years, it's good to see this being done for the alternative position. So yeah, no, François, I recruit more and more people to the cause.
I think he does. He is sort of doing a very valid taxonomy. I mean, giving you the
absolutely, and more than that, he's also arguing for a position within it. He's
yes, exactly.
It's fantastic. It's great to have him on board. He's one. It's fantastic.
Keith, what subheading would you put for the book? Descartes Prison. Well, what would you have as?
Oh, do they have to have subheadings these days? Yeah,
you can have a nice catchy tag.
I don't know. Let me think. But I might not even go with that. But
something catchier.
Well, it's. I want to allow people to escape from this prison. So it's no, I don't know, escaping the illusion of phenomenal consciousness or something like that, maybe. A lot of people, it's surprising how many people you find who are interested in philosophy on social media, sites like Twitter and Reddit and so on, are absolutely convinced of that all they are directly acquainted with is their own mental states. Even if they're realists, even if they think that they're still indirect realists, even if they're not idealists, they think that we're all locked into private mental worlds, and they cannot see, some of them, how there could be any other way of taking this. So they're locked into what is it may not be idealist, but it's got strongly idealist tendencies to think that at best we can infer the presence of a non-mental world. It seems to me such a the view has never remotely appealed to me, and it seems such a strange and anthropocentric, I suppose, view of of the world, which centers our. I mean, one way of trying to unpack this is to imagine, I suppose, building an artificial creature that is gradually acquires more and more perceptual capacities and abilities to monitor its own perceptual capacities and to talk about them and to monitor its own reactions to perception, to talk about those, and in fact, this is something I'm trying to do, and to trace the progress to the point where it's convinced itself that it is that is only aware of its own mental states. I think there's a certain I mean, animals, I take it, and non-human animals just live in the world. There's just the world there, and of which they are part, and their bodies are part, and they live in that world, and that is immediate to them. And they never for a moment think that they are just living in the world of their own experience. Now, what do you need to add to that sort of animal experience? What sort of self-monitoring systems do you need to add, self-monitoring processes do you need to add to get to the point where you start to think of your experience that way, as merely a screen between you and the world.
You touched on idealist views now at this point. François and I, when we were chatting, he asked me about my view and how it's changed over time, and I'm pretty sure you're curious as to it as well since
yeah.
But I told him that I still have very much illusionist intuitions, but my openness to discussing these concepts with other people has really grown since then. And while prior to starting the podcast, I would take idealism completely. I would not even consider it, to put it on the table to discuss. But now I find some of them very fascinating, very intriguing. Some panpsychist theories are very intriguing. So what he said that I'm doing is I'm creating these wonderful pockets and virtual realities, and then going into it with these people, having a great discussion and coming out, which is very good because it does allow me to not make it feel like a debate for them and not make it feel like I'm there to bring down their view, but rather to explore it. But when I think about it now, what has happened to my own view is I still very much have these illusionist tendencies and intuitions, but I've become more and more mysterious. At this point, I really don't know what consciousness is, and nor do I think we'll be able to find the solution to the mind-body problem.
Oh, interesting. First, I think you're absolutely right to enter into the world of the person you're talking to. Otherwise, you don't appreciate their perspective. You need to enter into it. This is what I was asking for people to do.
Exactly.
The illusionist perspective.
Which is why I'm here, Keith. I'm going to try and do that for you today.
We need to do the same thing with the people we disagree with in order to appreciate, in order to be fair to them, in order to we have to inhabit their point of view to understand its power, its potential. You can't evaluate a point of view from an external point of view. You need to inhabit it for a while, see what it feels like, try it on, see if this suit of clothes works for you, or, you know, in my metaphor, climb up that hill and have a look from there and see how things look. And if you don't like the view or the thing doesn't fit, well, fine, okay. But that's the only way you're going to really appreciate its attractions. And there may be stuff you can bring back from that, the insights from that you can bring back and incorporate into your own perspective. I'm mixing my metaphors horribly here. So yes, I think that's absolutely the way to do it. In fact, if you don't do that, then I think really you're not doing philosophy. You're just rather dogmatically defending a certain position that you've decided to pin your colours to. No, but Mysterianism.
Look, I'm not even sure, to be honest. I just have I'm so ontologically agnostic at this point that I just don't know. It's become a bit blurry, let's say.
I suppose my attitude is, Dennett has a nice example that I think a bowl of yeast has about the same number of cells as a human brain. And the cells themselves have individually considered in isolation have much the same complexity, similar internal structure. And metaphysically, I guess, on a par, the difference is in how the cells in the brain are connected up. The complexity of what they're doing. And so I think the default metaphysical position would be that we don't need a new metaphysics for what the brain is doing. The metaphysics that will work for what, I don't know, the liver or the digestive system or the cells in a bowl of yeast are doing. Let's assume that that works for the brain too, which is just a bunch of similar cells connected up in a very, very special way that is the product of billions of years of evolution and of thousands of years of cultural evolution too. So let's take that as our default position and see if we can't explain everything within that. Now, if in the end we can't, if there's some things we can't explain, fine, then we might need to expand our ontology. But let's just try it first. That should be the default approach, I think. And the fact that you can sit in your armchair and say, well, I can't see how we could account for the manifest features of consciousness in that way. Well, you can't. That's an intuition you have. You're predisposed to think that. Okay, fine. That doesn't really establish anything except that you have this sense that there's something mysterious. Yeah. And it may be that we can explain why you think there's something mysterious. In fact, why you have some people have an unshakable conviction that there's something mysterious, and that it seems that this mysterious thing is the thing they know better than anything else in the whole world. Maybe we can explain that. And if we can, then you have a situation where we're saying, well, okay, I have this unshakable conviction that I'm directly and immediately presented with something that can't be explained in physical terms. But we've explained exactly why I have that conviction. I know exactly why I have that conviction. And it's not because the explanation doesn't actually mention anything that can't be explained in physical terms. It's all couched in the terms of cognitive science. So it completely explains that sense I have without assuming it's true, but I'm going to trust it anyway. That would be like someone who says, look, I saw a UFO last night, and someone kind of investigates and says, well, actually, it was due to this piece of space junk re-entering the atmosphere or some atmospheric effect or whatever. And they explain exactly why it looked as if there was a UFO at that place there. And the person says, well, yeah, I grant you that all those things you mentioned, those non-UFO things were present and they would have looked like a UFO, but there was still a UFO there. Maybe it was hiding behind all of that. Mm. I'm just going to trust my intuition anyway. Well, you can do that, but
But our intuitions are not the best source of information.
And perhaps particularly when we're thinking about ourselves. Why should our intuitions about our own minds be wonderfully reliable? We'd expect them to be useful, perhaps, maybe, unless they're just side effects. If they're adaptations, then we'd expect them to be useful. But a lot of useful attitudes are not strictly true. And it might just be a side effect of other processes. So
I think, yeah, to give you an example of where the Mysterianist aspects start to come in, for me at least, is when you see people's work like, let's say, Michael Levin, and how his work can sort of build up into a panpsychist view. And his work is so compelling and so amazing that you can't help but give a lot more credence to the philosophical view afterwards. I don't necessarily believe he does consider himself a panpsychist, but his thought process and the science behind it does and eventually lead to that. And then on the other side, you've got someone like Donald Hoffman with the physics behind it, and then you sort of ask yourself, if we don't understand the nature of reality, can we really make plausible arguments for certain natural phenomenon? And then I get stuck in that dilemma. But
well, there certainly might be a case for expanding a mentalistic vocabulary quite widely. I mean, Dan thought this. He thought that the intentional stance can be usefully applied at all sorts of levels, including at the levels of molecular biology. So maybe that intentional idioms can be usefully applied quite widely.
Dan's multiple drafts theory also assists with that.
So who's?
Dan's multiple drafts theory also
yes,
does.
Yes, in fact. So maybe that certain aspects of mentalistic, certain mentalistic concepts can be, but I don't see how panpsychism doesn't have any explanatory power at all. This is the thing that Philip is insisting on. It doesn't contradict, or it needn't at least contradict anything in physics or in molecular biology or neuroscience or anything like that, any the third person physical science. It's simply providing an account of the intrinsic nature of all the things mentioned in those accounts, where that intrinsic nature itself doesn't make any difference to anything. And so all it's accounting for is our intuition, this intuition that there's something intrinsic that's not accounted for by the third person story. Now it seems to me that scientists as such have no need of that hypothesis. It's not doing any work. It's a fifth wheel. So I'd be skeptical about that. The thing that strikes me about Don's work is, of course, that he stresses how much perception is distorting and caricatured and so on for adaptive purposes. But it seems that introspection is completely immediate and reliable, and our own consciousness is known to us in such an immediate way that we can even justify taking it as the foundation of all reality. That our insight into our insight into our awareness of the world around us is deeply, deeply distorting, but our awareness of our own minds is so perfect that it's actually a window onto fundamental reality of the world. I don't think that's taking evolution seriously. I don't think it's taking the idea that introspection itself is an evolutionary.
With Don, at least, I appreciate the fact that Don admits that. So Don will.
Yes, he does.
Yes. He will say that reality, fundamentally, we have zero insight as to what reality really is. But here I am making a leap because I have to make some sort of a prediction in order to sort of prove this. So at least he does that. Which is,
I mean, if he wanted to say that reality is utterly, utterly unknown to us, then I would say, okay, maybe it is. But there's this idea that there's a sort of hole at the fundamental level, in our picture of the fundamental level. And so what should we put in it? Well, we need something that's not derived from the higher levels. And so what is there? Well, there's our insight into our nature of our own consciousness. Well, I suppose it fits the bill in the sense that it does seem anomalous in some way. It doesn't seem to be easily explained in terms of these higher levels. So it does seem as if it's something extra and the sort of thing that might be fundamental and so might therefore be capable of being plugged into this gap. But I just think the idea that just massively estimates our sort of epistemic powers as evolved creatures. Why? I like to have imagine that there's some alien species that have never evolved our sort of consciousness. Let's say they've evolved as illusionists. Okay, so they think of themselves as complex pieces of complex biological organisms that have a certain awareness of their own mental operations, which may be simplified and so on, but they never tempts them to think that there's anything non-physical about their own minds. They don't think there's a hard problem. They just think that they can be completely explained by cognitive science. They're quite happy with this. But they have noticed this other gap at the fundamental level, that there seems to be something that we don't have an account of what the fundamental nature of reality is. Now, it doesn't occur to them to think that their own minds supply them with any evidence of this, because they think their own minds are completely explicable. But then they come and visit us, and they notice that we seem to be aware of something in our own minds. So they come to visit us on this tiny little planet on this, this sort of remote, Douglas Adams location on the unfashionable outer reaches of the spiral arm of the galaxy. And they say, oh, look, these creatures have found the answer to the problem of what the fundamental is, something in their minds. I mean, it just seems too parochial, too contingent, too self-aggrandizing to think that I, sitting in my armchair, reflecting on my own mental capacities, can see into the fundamental nature of reality. I don't know, it's somehow my weightings in my Bayesian network just won't allow me to go that way at all. Yeah. And I honestly find it quite difficult to think what the weightings would have to be like for me to go that way.
I'm looking at this landscape of consciousness. I mean, and this will just sort of reiterate why I'm becoming so much more and more Mysterian. I mean, look at this. So we
should talk more often.
Look, there are materialist views, quantum views, integrated information, panpsychisms, monisms, dualisms, idealisms, anomalous and altered states, challenges, non-reductive physicalisms, illusionisms, of course, as part of the materialist ones. There's just so many different theories right now. We just looking at this when
yes.
There's just
but now divide those into ones that take phenomenal realism seriously, essentially ones that trust the zombic hunch. Divide those into ones that trust the zombic hunch and ones that don't, and you'll find that I predict something like that. Probably, I don't know, 90% of them do. Maybe that's over. A lot of them do, and a lot of that variety comes in trying to spell out ways of what paths you can go down once you trust the zombic hunch. And there are many. But if the zombic hunch isn't reliable, the explosion of this proliferation of ways you can go is really, it's a testament to human ingenuity. But as Dan would say, they're all just variants of chess that no one really plays, that reality doesn't play. They're all just if you know, Dan has this idea of chess, which is a game where, just like chess, except the king can move 2 squares at any one time. Okay, now you can study the theory of chess, and it will be as elaborate and complex as that diagram shows. But it's not the game that we play, and maybe phenomenal realism isn't the game that reality plays. And if it's not, exploring all these wonderful very brilliantly articulated options isn't getting us anywhere.
It's also quite a wonderful time to be alive with consciousness being such a vibrant topic at this point. It's pretty cool to see this happening, which is the premise of this podcast and your podcast, which is quite cool, I think.
Yes, certainly it's exciting, and because we are thinking about the I was going to say something like the essence, the heart of our existence, and in a way, I think that too, because I do think that what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness, about the way things feel, is how things matter to us. And this is the reactivity thing, maybe, which we can come back to. Our talk about what experience is like is an attempt to express the significance, to capture the essence of an essence of significance, if you like, in our, which we can't articulate, but which is somehow we have a sense of the shape, the overall shape. This is what I think. This is why I get to talk about schemas and so on. I think that we have introspective processes that model the overall shape of our responses, our internal responses to stimuli, and that capture in a few crude dimensions their overall outline. And when we ask ourselves, when we reflect on our own experience, we have an inarticulate sense of the shape of our current reactive state. And it seems to us, inexpressible. We can compare the shape of this reactive pattern with other reactive patterns. We can say it's a bit like that one, it's not like that one, and we can say something about its valence, whether we like it or don't like it. We can talk about how other occasions when we've been in states like this, we can suggest to other people that they might like try to cultivate states like this or avoid them or whatever. But we don't see any of the detail, and so it seems inexpressible. It seems, well, it is inexpressible in certain ways, and it seems to us. And so it is very, very important to us. It's how the world is affecting us, and there's hardly anything more important to us individually than that. So I forgot where I was going on this. I'm sorry. I was trying to give you there as
I think you were slowly going to take us into reactivity.
I was going to, but I realized that I was trying to take you too far into it without really setting the ground up. So So much for my attempts to convey this accessibly.
Look, it's conscious. It's complicated.
Do you want to take me back to the beginning of the reactivity thing and let me try and do it better?
Let's actually frame out this reactivity schema theory for everyone.
Yes.
This is some new content that I think people would want to know about.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, I've got a quote here. Let me introduce this with a quote from Dennett again. Dennett's always in my mind, particularly in my mind now. It's from a paper in 1923, I think, in which he was, I think it's his response to contributions to a symposium on consciousness explained. And he says this, he's talking about the effects that stimuli have on us. And he says this, what anchors our naive sense that there are such properties as qualia are the multiple, asymmetrical, interdependent set of reactive dispositions by which we acquaint ourselves with the sensible world. So his stimuli impact on our sense organs, and they produce a lot of effects on us. And it's these effects, these multiple, asymmetrical, interdependent set of reactive dispositions associated with each stimulus that he says is the root of our sense that we have qualia, which will be the solution to the illusion problem. Our sense that the color red has, as it were, an identity, a personality, all of its own, is due to the host of different associations that go with each color. So he's not, so he notice how there's a complete inversion here. It's not that there is an object there, the feeling of red, the quality of red, that we are reacting to. It's that there's simply the external stimulus that we're reacting to. And it's our awareness of this complex of reactions that gives us the sense that there's something in us that has that richness of the feel of red, if you like. It's not something here that we're reacting to. It's our sense of how we're reacting.
Yes, there's a process that's occurring between that and then your actual response to the stimulus.
The idea is that there isn't anything occurring in between that. It's our awareness of the downstream effects of perception. So it's not that when we talk about the feel of the experience, we're not talking about something that causes the downstream effects. We're talking about the downstream effects themselves. Yes. Let me read a little bit more.
Before you continue, I remember even a part of one of your papers in the past where you mentioned that the actual neurons firing in themselves is exactly it's technically is the feeling, that is what's occurring.
Yes, but not just the neurons. It's what the neurons are doing when they're firing, but not just the ones on the perceptual side. This is the thing that Dan continually presses. We tend to talk about what's the conditions that are necessary for a bit of information, a bit of perceptual content to enter consciousness. So there's some stimulus, and it's processed by, say, visual certain wavelength of light impacting on the retina, and that triggers all sorts of perceptual processes. And then we think of this as building up, and the more and more processing, more and more integration of different features that have been detected, and so on. And at some point, it enters consciousness. And as Dan puts it, many theories of consciousness just stop there. They say, what's necessary if it enter consciousness, right? Well, but then, as Dan puts it, what happens next? What's the upshot of this entering consciousness? If nothing happens, then there was no point in it entering consciousness. In fact, if there's no downstream effect of it entering consciousness, then it might as well not have entered consciousness, because if it doesn't affect how you react in any way, then what was the point of it? I mean, it's just like some epiphenomenon, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Now, his thought is, when you start tracing out what happens after that, all the effects that the stimulus has, the downstream effects, that's where all the action is. Because even if the thing had definitively entered, the content had definitively entered consciousness, it would still have to have all those downstream effects for it to mean anything, for it to have any psychological significance. So the real impact of the stimulus, the real sense that it matters to me is due to those downstream effects. So you can just cut out the bit about it entering consciousness. That's not doing anything. Even if it did, it would still have to be processed downstream for it to matter to me. That's where the actual clout of conscious experience is. So forget about that. So where does consciousness come in? Well, consciousness is our sense of all those downstream effects of what the stimulus is doing, how it's, I like to say, I got loads of metaphors, I keep trying them out. Like it's like the vibration that occurs in a bell when you strike it. A certain complex pattern of, the pattern of ripples that happen when you throw some sand into a pool of still pool of water. That's the consciousness, or the effects. Let me just read a bit more. Supposing that there is something in addition to these complex families of reactive dispositions, is falling for, wait for it, an illusion, plain and simple, an illusion of subtraction, you might call it. Dan's commenting on something Sidney Shoemaker had written about his work, so he mentioned Shoemaker. Shoemaker seems to go along with the natural but treacherous assumption that reactive dispositions must involve the person reacting to a quale, presented somehow to the reactor, and causing, by its presentation, the reaction. The given is then taken. For instance, here's how pain works. The pain networks produce, somewhere central, the awfulness quale, which is then the very property to which one, again, who's reacting here, reacts with abhorrence. My view, and this is the Copernican shift. My view is that this confuses cause and effect. That was my word, Copernican shift. My view is that this confuses cause and effect. It is the reactions that compose the introspectable property. And it is through reacting that one identifies or recognizes the property. Now, I think if you dwell on that sufficiently and trace out its consequences fully, then I think you've pretty much got an answer to what I call the illusion problem, and you've got a theory of consciousness that is at least a good placeholder until we get empirical work that really maps out the territory properly for us.
I see now why reactivity schema theory. At first, I thought you were going to refer to attention schema theory, and the name, which I may not stick with, actually, some people advise me not to. The name is modeled on that. Yeah. The idea, what Michael Graziano has attention schema theory, proposes attention schema theory, and the idea is that the brain needs to control its own attentional processes. Attentional processes are complex. How do you control them? Well, you need to have a model. To control something, you need to have a model of it. So the brain creates a model of its own, monitors its own attentional processes, and creates a model of them. But the model doesn't need to represent all the detail. In fact, it would not be very useful for control purposes if it did. So the brain creates a schematic, simplified model of attention. I can't remember exactly how Graziano characterizes it, but it models it almost like an energy that flows out of the eyes and attaches to things and tracks them, and that itself can magically capture information and produce effects on the rest of the mind. Models it in that simplified way. That's enough for control purposes and for tracking other people's attention as well. In fact, the interest was more in tracking other people's attention, I think. Yeah, and it's very cool the way he has some of that work where if someone's looking at you, or if you show someone a diagram of them looking at a tree, they'll think the tree's tilting away from the person because
they feel there's a sort of potency in attention itself, that it's like an energy in itself. Yes, exactly. That's his idea. That's how the brain models attention for its own control purposes. And then when we try to introspect and ask ourselves about our attention, essentially what we do is we tap information from that model. And we don't have it all, it doesn't come to us like, oh, this is the model that my brain has constructed of attention. We just get this sense that attention is something like an energy that flows out of our eyes. We have these intuitions that attention works in this kind of way. And then when we try to reflect on this, we elaborate this into a theory of the mind as something that's separate from the physical process in the brain. That we elaborated into a dualistic theory of the mind as an immaterial thing that can catch on to things in the world and get information about them and have magical effects on the rest of the physical brain. So it's this model, this simplified model, that then when we draw information from that model and try to reflect on the nature of our own minds, it induces us to adopt a dualistic perspective. Now, my idea was to extend this a bit. I don't think anything that I want to say contradicts what Graziano says, but it's more of an extension of it, I think. And the idea is something like this, that it's also useful for the brain to have a model of how it's being affected by current stimulation. If you think that any stimulus is going to have all sorts of, well, if you like, affordances, for instance, it's going to suggest all kinds of actions we could take, approaching, retreating, might be treating as a source of food, as a potential mate or something, or whatever. I don't know. There's many different dimensions of possible action along which each stimulus can be assessed. And the idea is the brain is continually doing this. It's not just observing the world just for the fun of it, like an aesthete. It's searching for significance in everything around us, and this significance is going to be, if you like, included in the pattern of reactive dispositions that are being strengthened or triggered. So the brain is going to be priming itself for action, even if it's not actually initiating action. It's going to be certain readiness potentials, whatever, are going to be going up, and so on, and expectations are going to be changing. And if you think of the map of the reactive potential, as it were, of the brain, it's going to be continually changing on all sorts of dimensions. One basic dimension might be valence. Is this a good situation or a bad situation for me? That might be the dominant one. Do I like this? Do I want this to continue, or do I not like it and want it to stop? But that could be broken down into many sub-dimensions. Okay, so you think about this overall map of reactivity that is like a multidimensional shape that is continually evolving as stimulation comes in. Now, for most there's no need to model that. You just go with the first order reactions, as it were. You just live in the world. But suppose you're, say, a social animal, or an animal that is capable of certain sorts of higher order, reflective thinking. Then it would be useful to have information about this, because, for instance, one thing, if you're a social animal, you can communicate this to other people. You can say that stimulus, that thing is not good. It's kind of, I don't know, that berry tastes very bitter. Don't try it. It has this effect on me. If I can be aware of the effect and encapsulate it in some way in speech, then I can usefully convey to other people what sort of effect it would have on them if they were to try it, without their having to actually try it. Animals can't do that. I mean, non-human animals, well, that's simplifying, but a lot of them can't do that. A dog can't really convey to another dog that it shouldn't try that food that made it sick. The other dog might see the dog being sick and decide, it's not going to, but the first dog can't just say, don't eat that, it's horrible. Can't do that. We can, because we can have a sense of how the thing affected us, and we can encapsulate that in crude linguistic terms. We can also use this information about how things affect us, about sort of reactivity profile of different stimuli, to plan courses of action. We can say, well, that was really nice. I like that. I'll make that recipe again or something. Or, I'll make sure to avoid doing that again. Again, non-human animals can certainly learn by reinforcement learning and so on not to do things again, but they can't reflectively plan and think, I really like that thing. I will actually make a strategy for seeking it out. They can, as it were, hack their own reactivity patterns. So it'd be really useful, I think, and I think the social use is key. It'd be really useful for the brain to be able to model this reactivity in some, again, schematic way, not in all of the massively complex, 86 billion neurons or whatever, but in a schematic way that gives a sense of what the stimulus means for you, its significance. Now, then again, when we ask ourselves, when we reflect on our current condition, what it's like to be us right now, we tap information from this model. And again, it doesn't come to us in a detailed form. It's just an intuitive sense of positive, negative, a different, frightening, comforting, sweet, beautiful, ugly, whatever. Different dimensions of assessment. It just comes to us as an intuition of significance, a sort of essence of significance, which we have words for, but we can't seem to pin down because it's not articulated in a detailed enough way. And this essence of significance is what we're gesturing at with our talk about what it's like. Mm. But it is, in fact, simply there's what we have here are judgments based on a schematic model of the reactivity patterns created by stimuli. And that's, in outline, the solution to the illusion problem. And it's based entirely on this suggestion from Dennett.
I think it's quite cool that he's right there by your shoulder, because you obviously stood on the shoulder of a giant while prepping.
Absolutely.
It's very nice. It's a very nice touch. Keith, I wanted to tell you, when I spoke to Carl Friston,
mm-hmm.
I actually eventually got him to say that the Bayesian brain approach, active inference, and then free energy principle could sort of lead you to an illusionist theory of consciousness, and he eventually agreed, because I'm not sure if you remember, but in my paper I spoke about how if you use this sort of inference and active inference, and if people sort of get these prior information that tells them that they have this ineffable qualitative experience that is essence-like, they're more likely to then have a posterior decision that is, I am conscious, I am physically conscious. And if you give them less, like a psychotic patient who's having this almost unrealistic derealization from reality, they're not conscious. And then he sort of agreed. He said, yes, if you do take it to that, if you do frame the argument that way, it will lead to an illusionist theory of consciousness. I just thought I'd share that with you.
And I think that's very much the perspective that Andy Clark has developed on this. There's a paper in the collection of essays on, I can't remember the title. There's a collection of essays on the work of Dennett. Again, there's a paper in there by Andy Clark, which really applies predictive processing theory, I think along the general lines you're suggesting. So yeah, I think there's.
I should have actually gotten that paper published. I just got so lazy afterwards and forgot to do it.
Good time.
So yeah, probably should, because people ask me all the time, where is this paper? I should probably make it available. Yeah, I think I probably will. Want to go to some of the questions from the audience, or?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. I see someone asked, when was fire invented?
Yes, I saw that one. Do you have an answer to that question? I don't know if you.
Well, I imagine fire itself has been around for a very, very long time. I suppose he means the human
fire of consciousness
ability to manipulate fire.
I just think that person was just playing.
Good question, actually, because I think fire played a very. Nick Humphrey has a wonderful suggestion about the role of the fire as a center of community. Yes. For early human societies, coming around the fire and telling stories, and the role of this in early human society and its importance. And he actually suggests that maybe one of the reasons humans lost their body hair was precisely so that they needed to congregate around the fire and thereby cultivate this important means of social exchange and interaction and creativity. So I think it's a very important question.
It is. I think this person was making a joke, but unfortunately you gave a very good answer.
All jokes have most of them have.
I've got one here from Tom Clark. It says, this was 2 days ago. Perhaps note that qualia is now freighted with anti-physicalist and anti-naturalist connotations in a way that, speaking of sensory qualities like the feeling of pain or taste of pleasure, is not. Why deny that there are qualities present in experience?
Well, look, I'm trying to sketch well, first of all, because a lot of it's freighted with a lot of all that stuff, and I want to get rid of that. Now, I'll then go on and tell you some positive story, which I sort of tried to do in a possibly somewhat garbled way there, about what is actually happening and about modeling of reactivity and so on, okay? And the reactivity is what I would be inclined to call conscious. I don't think, by the way, you need to do this modeling in order to count as being a conscious being. I'm quite happy to say that creatures that don't do the modeling, whose brains don't do the modeling, are still conscious, because they're still actively engaged with the world. They're still resonating with the world. This pattern of ripples that, as I talked about, is still occurring within them. And that's what I think. That's what we should use the word consciousness for, if we're going to creature consciousness, if you like, as opposed to unconsciousness. So look, I will get there. Will then go on. I will say qualia in that sense of illusion, and I'll explain what picture I put in its place. And I won't use the word qualia in that. Now, if you want to say, someone wants to say, look, I like that picture. I think it's quite good, and I want to pin the word qualia on that feature of it. Well, knock yourself out. I mean, call it what you want. I just don't want you to bring any of the baggage that word used to use. And I think the neatest way here is just to use a new word, so that it's quite clear. It's like someone saying, look, phlogiston theory, phlogiston, there's all wrong with it. Now, this oxygen stuff, this sounds really quite promising, but I want to call it oxygen phlogiston. Well, go on if you want. You'll confuse people, and you might end up confusing yourself if you're not careful. But, if you really want to, go for it. The word doesn't matter. The question is, what work was that word doing that my story isn't doing? Now, if you can point to some work that needs to be done and that my story isn't doing, great, I'll listen. If what it's doing is the kind of stuff that the word qualia was mostly doing, which is pointing to something that poses a hard problem and that is conceptually completely independent of the vocabulary of cognitive science and so on, and that you just, well, I don't want to do that work, so I don't think that word needs doing.
Yeah, and here's another one. Actually, Keith doesn't call consciousness an illusion, just phenomenality. But it's an interesting question of what picks out conscious states from a first-person standpoint if there's nothing qualitative about them.
Right. Well, look, you can recognize when you're seeing stuff. You can tell. If you're having let's compare it with unconscious perception. You don't know that if you're unconsciously adjusting your position, say because of a long-standing let's say back problem, and you're unconsciously adjusting your position, you might say that you explain that by an unconscious perception of discomfort or something. But if you're not aware, if somebody says, "Are you aware of discomfort?" You say, "No." They say, "Well, you seem to be sitting in a funny way. You must be." Well, okay, maybe there's some unconscious perception of discomfort and that affected your behavior, but you weren't aware of it. So it's being able to figuring it. Look, again, Dan's cerebral celebrity, it having enough effects of the kind we typically associate with consciousness, the kind we take to be, think about what would it take to be the signs of consciousness. What are the symptoms of being conscious? Well, one of them is being able to report it. So if you're doing an experiment, you say, was the subject conscious of that very faint light? Well, one way to do it is to say, to ask them, say when you're conscious of the light.
That reminds me a lot of Susan Blackmore's work.
Of who?
Susan Blackmore. It reminds me of.
Yes, absolutely. Another way is to use nonverbal measures to say, for instance, whether there's, they look at eye movement and so on. So use all these measures. They're probably not always going to deliver the same results, but if you're getting a positive score on a significant number of them, it's conscious. And the same goes for you. How do you know you're conscious? Because it's having enough effects on you for you to be able to talk about it. Do you notice this? Do you notice that you're in the state? Simply, do you recognize the state?
And also, I often feel like it also comes down to language. A very big part of this is the fact that we have these internal thought monologues that occur in a specific language, and we've given these terms to these things. And I think that's a big factor we often don't consider.
And the effect that internal monologue has on what comes to our attention.
Yes.
This is the thing about the multiple drafts. When you start questioning yourself, did I see that? Did I not see that? That pulls up bits of information, triggers them, boosts them into popularity suddenly. And so as soon as you start attending to some internal sensation, it blows up. It becomes much more significant than it was. Its effects become greater. The great trick to living with mosquito bites is to try and distract your attention from them. As soon as you attend to them, they become unbearable. Distract your attention from them, they go away and they vanish. we're continually attending to stuff that's happening in our minds. Some of us more than others, perhaps, and perhaps people of anxious disposition like myself are over attending to things that are going on in us, and we're thereby boosting their significance. And this, and there's a sort of, I think this is something that Susan talks about. Yes, Susan Blackmore talks about that, the way that it's the fridge light phenomenon. When you open the fridge, the lights on. Again, when you probe yourself, there's always stuff to be found, and the more you probe, the more there is. And it can seem like there's an sort of endless richness there, because the more you probe, the more you find. But it's better to say, I think, perhaps the more you probe, the more you create, the more you stimulate, the more reactions you provoke, and therefore the more awareness of those reactions there is. I'll tell once again my favorite. This is one of the examples I'm working that I like to use that will come into the book eventually. You go to the fridge and you're looking for something, and I probably mentioned this 3 years ago. You're looking in the fridge, and let's say you're looking for the pickles, the jar of pickles, and you open the door and you look, and you don't see it. There's just no pickles there. Okay, and you call to your partner, "Where are the pickles? You said we had some." And your partner says, "They're in the fridge on the middle shelf. Just look." And you open the door again, and bang, they're there, right where you'd been looking before. Now, it's very tempting to think, what was my experience like the first time? If I could rewind the inner tape of my experience and examine it again, when I first looked in the fridge, what would have been at that location? Well, we know what would have been at that location in the fridge, namely the pickles, but what was at that location in my experience of the fridge? Was there a hole there? Was there the pickle jar there, but somehow it was in my experience, but I didn't experience it? That doesn't make sense. Was there something else that did my brain make up some other object there? Now, the point is, there is no answer to that question, because the light bouncing off the pickle jar didn't produce any reactions. There was neither something there, nor a hole there, nor anything there. There was just, you simply missed it. It simply didn't figure in your consciousness in one way or another. There was no reactions.
This is where that Bayesian sort of framework might come into assist as well. I mean, you've been given the priors. Merely by your wife saying that it's in the fridge, you now go in looking for something very different.
You know where to attend.
That spot, yes, exactly.
Exactly. That's why the experience is transformed the second time. Mm. But if you think that there are determinate contents of consciousness, then you have to answer the question, what were the determinate contents of my consciousness at that particular location at the moment of the first time I looked? And there is no answer to that is remotely plausible. Neither a pickle jar, nor a kind of black hole, nor any other sort of hole, nor any other sort of product. Why would the brain create another product? There's no answer to that. Mm. This is like change blindness experiments.
Yes,
it's remotely plausible. The answer is there was no determinate stream of consciousness for that to be a question about.
Mm. Yes.
It was simply the fridge and you and your reactions to the fridge.
And we often forget about this poor predictive processing power in our brains, the limited resources we're using.
Absolutely.
We're just continuously confabulating, lying to ourselves. We're not perfect.
Absolutely. And again, this is something that Don Hoffman, for example, emphasizes so much with regard to perception, but simply doesn't extend to our awareness of ourselves. Now, if you take seriously the idea that we are part of the same world as the world that our perceptual systems are monitoring, that we're just another part of that, then our awareness of ourselves is going to be subject to exactly the same limitations and constraints. Mm. And if it doesn't seem so, well, that's very interesting. And maybe there are good evolutionary reasons why it doesn't seem so. Mm. But let's ask ourselves why it doesn't seem so, rather than just trusting that it actually isn't so.
I think that the one positive about it, or let's say illusionism as a theory of consciousness, or an idealism or panpsychist view, is that all three of those have a better moral/ethical implication, in the sense that we would treat all species around us in a similar manner. Whereas an emergentism phenomenon will break away that. So you're no longer part of the same structure. You're no longer similar in that regard. So I guess there is that pro with these opinions.
That's the moral I try to bring out in my recent paper on the ethical implications of illusionism. I address arguments that worries that illusionism has negative ethical implications, and try to show that they're not well-founded at all, and then suggest some positive consequences. And it's absolutely it. I mean, if most views of consciousness actually have this consequence that consciousness is a binary thing. It's either present or not. Mm-hmm. Okay, it might be a phenomenal consciousness. We're talking. It might be very limited, very, very small. It might be but it's like an inner light, and the inner light is either on or off. So there's a switch that goes on. Maybe when it goes on, there's just a very, 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 very dim light, or maybe suddenly it's like, you know, sort of the Las Vegas illuminations come on, but it's either on or off. Now, that's, I think, and that's quite a natural view, given that if you conceptualize some consciousness as something irreducibly subjective, well, there's either an irreducibly subjective world there or there isn't. You can't be sort of a bit irreducibly subjective. You can't have if there's another world, subjective world, it can't be just part of an, you know, half there. It's either there or there isn't one, no matter how tiny it might be. Well, so then you're going to have to divide the world into the conscious sheep and the non-conscious goats. And if you're going to tie moral worth to the possession of this inner light, then you're going to have to say that the goats don't have intrinsic moral worth. At best, they have instrumental value. I think that's a horrible picture, actually, which is completely insensitive to the way that creatures are actually affected by the world, which we can see. You know, you don't really need to do a lot of theorizing to see when a creature's suffering. It's kind of obvious, really. Yeah, unless, of course, you locate suffering in some private world, which is a really odd place to. It's a really odd to locate the primary source of ethical value in a world to which no one but the individual in question has access. Mm. It's really difficult to develop a shared ethics if you think that ethical judgment should be responsive to facts up to which we systematically have no access whatsoever, except in our own case. That's a very solipsistic sort of ethics. I find it quite, you know, I don't want to get too moralistic about it, but I think it's a bizarre view. And even on views like panpsychist views, which say, well, this inner light is in all the fundamental particles of matter, you still have a binary division between those creatures in which these micro consciousnesses of their components combine to form a macro consciousness. Yes. So you still have this
combination problem is still there.
The combination. Well, it's not just the combination problem, but the binary problem. The sheep and goats problem is still there. Either the micro consciousnesses have combined or they haven't, and you've no way of knowing. Yes. Or you can just speculate, and you can do a bit of some sort of a priori theorizing about this, but you no way of testing whether they do. All you can test are their reactions. Mm. So seeing significance in the pattern of reactions and well, isn't that where you should locate it? Isn't how what you're doing to the creature is affecting it in a concrete what effects is it having on its psychology? Is it resisting? Is it producing all sorts of stress reactions? Yeah. Is it something the creature doesn't want you to do and desperately wants you to stop doing? These are all questions which you can answer and which seem to me directly relevant. What's happening in some other metaphysical realm associated with the creature to which you have no access? That seems a very odd way of assessing whether you should do it.
Yeah, we in our last conversation we also went quite deep into the ethical implications, because that was also a part of what I focused on. When we do take ourselves out of that pedestal and we move ourselves, this heliocentric view or this anthropomorphic view of we are the most important, illusionism becomes a very, very good ethical position to take.
I think so, and I think it's also bound up with the conception of the self. I think this is very important. This is something that again Dan had revisionary views about the self. He thought the self was something like a narrative we tell about ourselves, a construction, a selective construction from events in our lives that we put together to create a sense of who we are. And the continuing thing is this thread of narrative that is linked, of course, to a particular body and human animal, but our sense of there being a self, a private self, is really a it's more like the relation an author has to their fiction. We know ourselves because we are sort of authoring ourselves as we go along. And so that's how we can offer authoritative statements about ourselves, not because we have access to to what we really are. We can see into our inner nature and describe it to others, but we kind of expressing what we take ourselves to be. We're in a way that an author is inventing the character that he wants to play a certain role. And again, this is part of breaking down this picture of there being a presentation of something to an inner self. And then, of course, this connects up with free will, because of this inner self then is supposed to have the freedom to respond to what's presented to it in a completely unconstrained, unconditioned way. It's got this presentation of the world. It appreciates it in some way, like the spectator, and then it's completely free to decide what downstream effects to have. On the Dettin picture, all of that is a sort of imposition, a kind of fictional imposition on what's really happening, which is that there's this huge pattern of reactivity. We are reacting, and then we are constructing ourselves as the authors of that reaction. But as it were, it's not that there is a little thing, a little self that initiated the reactions. It's that the reactions occur, and then we construct ourselves as the author of them. And perhaps some of them we disavow, and we say, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I don't know why I said that. I mean, I'm saying this now, I'm thinking, why did I put that way? That was a bad way of putting it. But it came out of my mouth, so I probably, at least it's been recorded, I have to stand by it. But in other cases, when I'm just playing around with ideas or whatever, I will say, no, I don't mean that. So why did I say that? It's the self is the bit is the portion of our activity that we endorse and author and hold on to. And of course, we can also do this in a way that can be somewhat damaging to ourselves if we hold on to mistakes we've made and to failures, and incorporate those into ourselves and think of ourselves as the person who made these mistakes, the person who let these other people down, the person who failed to achieve things, and build that into our narrative. Then that can, in a real sense, become ourself. And the story we've constructed then has all kinds of effects on how we later respond to other situations. Because if you're the sort of person who, according to the story, does this or that, then you'll tend to continue acting out that story.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got another one here, Keith.
Yeah, okay.
Is physicalism obviously true?
No. I don't think very much anything is obviously true.
Yeah.
No, it's all a matter of trying to find out how things, in the broadest sense of the term, fit together in the broadest sense of the term. No. In fact, I suspect for a lot of people it seems obviously false. I don't think what's obvious is always amazing. It's obvious that the sun moves through the sky, the Earth's flat. There's all sorts of things that.
I see we're getting quite a few more questions now. Do you want to run through them? So this one's from Tim Stevenson. Ask Keith if the perception of time is illusory in the same way as the perception of phenomenal properties.
Oh, well, heck. What a question. I certainly think perception of time is something that's constructed by our brains. Mm-hmm. And the question of how that construction relates to concepts of time employed by physicists, I don't think the brain probably constructs time using the same sort of conceptual apparatus physicists use. No, so A and B series or whatever. Well, that's metaphysics rather than physicists, but I certainly think it's a construction. Whether it's as misleading a construction, it's a useful construction.
It's useful and very inaccurate.
Yeah, and of course, perception of time is very variable as you get older. It runs much more quickly. So I certainly think there'll be illusory aspects to it, but it would depend on what you take what you take. I think, for instance, I think neuroscience and the cognitive sciences generally probably give us a good model of what's occurring in the brain. Now, what gives us a good model of what time is less clear. I suppose physics, ultimately, but I think there probably might be as good a case for using the word illusory of it as
I think Thomas Metzinger talks about this, that temporality. When he speaks about it, he does sort of hint at that illusory effect of it. I mean, we often perceive things as happening right now when we never really are seeing.
Oh, well, yes. Well, we could never. Yes, I mean, there's got to be time for everything to be processed. Certainly, I mean,
So literally,
awareness is going to lag behind.
Yeah. So quite literally, in that sense, everything temporally is illusory.
But of course, it's what's the within that framework. You can then you could take some sort of a standard representation of time and sort of say, that's normal representation, and then have specific temporal illusions within that. Yes. So you could regard the baseline perception of time as practical reality, and then talk about specific temporal illusions that can be, for instance, if you're in a sudden car crash or something and everything seems to slow down. So I suppose it's illusory relative to what? Relative to what baseline?
So there's multiple levels of illusory effects of time here.
Well, there's multiple levels of representation. And the point about talking about illusion is really to stress that some of them are misrepresentations. Now, they're probably all going to be misrepresentations in some sense, and they're going to miss out stuff. They're going to be incomplete. All representations are going to be that. The point about using a word like illusory is to stress that people are being misled about something that they feel confident about. That's the point. Yes. If everyone was used to, say, the Muller-Lyer illusion, if everyone's completely used to it and used to not trusting it at all, and then the fact that it's an illusion wouldn't really be very significant. It's the fact that people are trusting their intuitions about phenomenal consciousness and directing an awful lot of attention to building theories on the basis of this misrepresentation. That's why you talk of illusions appropriate. It's pragmatic, the value of the word.
Xiao Yang Yu, I hope I pronounced that correctly, asks, his views on determinism, is he a compatibilist? You, of course.
Yeah, I'm certainly a compatibilist in the sense that if determinism were true, I don't think it would be any threat to free will. Whether it is true is a matter for physicists, I guess. I don't think that introspection gives us any reason to think that it's not true. And I don't think that anything that matters to us about free will is dependent on on determinism not being true. I think if the world were completely deterministic, we would just be as free as we are. I think it's a matter of it's a totally different kind of set of concerns, if you like. Freedom doesn't depend upon determinism being false. That's what I think. But that's not to say that determinism is true or false. Don't think it matters, to be honest.
This question from Michael Addyman, I think, asking which version of a physical brain, in inverted commas, exists inside his head as you two sit there speaking. 8 billion human versions to choose from, countless other animal versions. Which perceptual model of a brain exists when no model is being rendered by an observer, in principle?
I'm not quite sure I understand about versions. Well, it's mine. It's the one that's been shaped by my particular genetics and my particular experience throughout my life. It's been tuned up by a distinctive pattern of experience. But which version of a physical brain? That's so that. Well, obviously, and the other animal versions have been shaped by different genetic information, different genetic codes, and the other 8 billion humans have been trained up by tuned up by different sorts of experiences. Which perception model of a brain exists when no model is being rendered? Well, that sounds a bit idealist.
That's what I'm getting from it as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an idealist, so the brains exist unperceived. So if idealism is the then I just don't.
Just for those listening or watching, we're on Twitter at the moment, or X.
Yes, I'm seeing this on Twitter on my other screen here. Yeah.
Any of these questions at the moment, Keith, that stand out to you that you'd like to answer before?
I'm not sure if I've got them all.
Okay.
I see one from Argon.
So yeah, go for that one.
Do you believe philosophers ever evangelize? Do philosophers ever spread the truth of a theory rather than explore the possibility the theory is true? I suppose we do. I was once someone once said it sounded like you were preaching in that talk, and I suppose I was, in that I wanted to. I do think evangelism, good news. I do think illusionism is good news. I say that. I think it's a liberating perspective. I think it liberates us from this prison of the self. Liberates us to really know each other. To know the bats, instead of thinking that the bats are just mysterious, what their inner lives are like. Who could know? Well, we could know. Just study bats carefully enough. If you talk to people who've studied bats, you might be surprised. So I think it's so maybe I do evangelize a bit in that way, but and when I talk about trying to get people to see the perspective, see another perspective.
Argon goes further by saying, should academics evangelize?
Well, I think that there's a role for it. There's a role certainly for getting people to say, come over here, come and look at this view. It's lovely. It's really wonderful. You're missing something. Come and look at the rainbow. I know it's lovely. So I think there's a role for it, but that isn't the whole purpose. It's not that I've just got this view, I think it's wonderful, and I'm just going to try and use any means of advertising and persuasion to get people to adopt it. No, I've got to back that. I've got to cash out that sort of check that I'm issuing. I've got to try and do the hard work of spelling out these attractions in a more sober and less rhetorical way. And I hope I try to do that in my academic papers. But I think there is a role for trying to get people to see why the picture is an attractive, why the sum of all that is an attractive picture. So yeah, I mean, we're human beings. We don't just deal in emotionless, rational exchanges. There's a role for saying this is good and bad. Yeah.
Do you think that there are things out there that exist as a standalone ontological primary of reality? Little bricks of stuff that come together, objects without a subject.
What was the last bit? Bits of stuff. I don't see that one. Bits of stuff that.
At some point, now people are just having their own discussion.
I don't think they exist. I mean, little bits of stuff. I don't know what that would mean. But I think there's a. I mean, out where? What was the question at the beginning?
Where is this? Do you think that there are things out there that exist as a standalone ontological primary of reality?
Out where?
Out there.
out where? What's in here?
Yeah. Good.
I think there's a world. I think there's a reality. And I think that the entity that I pick out by the first person pronoun, when I say I, is a bit of that reality. Now, is it made of bits of stuff? I suppose stuff's about as vague a word as you could use, isn't it? What's the fundamental nature of it all? Heaven knows. But I don't think there's an in here and an out there. I don't really know what that
these
means.
Questions sound like they're coming from idealists. Do you find that idealists tend to disagree with you more than panpsychists?
Oh, interesting question, that one.
Oh, this is from me now. This is no longer. This is just.
Oh, that's from you now. Yeah. No. Oh well, I see. I liked it. Okay, I'm going to say something that may not be very fair, and so perhaps I just shouldn't really say. But I don't know. There seems to be a certain sort of culture. I mean, I find that idealism. Okay, this won't sound good, but I'm going to say it, that I feel sometimes that idealism is a bit cultish.
I can
and that
see
people seem to find a sort of emotional comfort in it, or I'm not quite sure what they find in it, but they seem to find in it something that goes beyond its mere satisfactoriness as a metaphysical theory. That they find something in it that deeply answers to something that they really need, and I find them more, rather more aggressive, I think.
Or triggered, yeah, because if they've fundamentally formed their entire life's ontology around this, it is a lot more like attacking their religion in a sense.
Yes, I think that's right. Whereas panpsychists, the ones I deal with, like Philip, are, Philip believes it, absolutely, but he's also an academic philosopher. He's assessing this and the other theories in the way that an academic philosopher does, and he'll be quite passionate, but he'll also have powerful arguments. But then when we've finished, it's just, well, that was fun, wasn't it? We each, and I think Philip understands my view, I think, pretty well. And I hope I understand his. And I hope we're trying to regulate our interactions much more by the norms of academic discourse. And I don't think, Philip, I feel about it. I'll say on my part, there's no personal animus at all. I enjoy talking to him. And I find it, I compared these phenomenal realist positions to versions of chess, and some of these are quite interesting versions. It's interesting to see what moves can be made, even if one thinks it's not really capturing anything about reality.
I think ultimately the main goal should be having these discussions without sort of attacking people and going to, because I can see some of the comments when people are trying to ask questions for you. If it's an idealist, you can kind of sort of tell there's an animosity there, and that needs to be eliminated. People need to have open discourse.
Well, as you say, if it really means something important to them, I can understand it. I have no wish to upset people or...
And people should not wish to upset you either, because, that seems like some of their goals.
I prefer not. But if it's expressed, I suppose there is an interesting comparison with religion here, that religion, people invest a lot of their identity in it, and they see it as foundational to their morality. And naturally, if you do that, you're going to feel quite very threatened by its denial, and you're going to feel that its denial has terrible consequences because it's the foundation of morality. And if you feel that way, well, I suppose the first question is: are you interested in exploring whether there's an alternative, or are you just, if you're perfectly happy with that and you don't see any problems with it, you don't feel there's any tensions in it, you don't feel it's creating any sort of dissonance in you, and you're going to feel threatened or by anyone who tries to articulate an alternative, then let's leave it.
I must say, when I speak to idealist philosophers, physicists, scientists, there is a genuine respect for academia when some of them talk about it. You can tell that they dislike the fact that their followers make them these cult leaders as well. So on their behalf, I'd like to actually defend them in that regard, because many of them notice this and don't particularly like it either.
I think that's certainly true of Don Hoffman, who
yes, most definitely for him. And he's one of those people I'm definitely referring to as well.
But it's an interesting cultural, sociological, psychological phenomenon that I'm not sure what it is about our current. We could start getting into grand sort of speculations about the zeitgeist, I suppose.
I have a theory of why.
Have you?
It's because a lot of them, when they provide you with their theory, there's almost always a teleological aspect to it. And I think that really hits home with some people.
Yeah.
The fact that there is a purpose now, because with an illusionist view, there's not necessarily a teleological outcome here. We're still going through the universe in the middle of nowhere. What can we do? Whereas when an idealist theory comes out, there often is something. It's the universe trying to experience itself, various versions of itself. The outcome is love. There's purpose. There is, and look, there are many different versions of idealism. So I'm not speaking.
It's true.
But it often comes with an overarching theme that is driven by a teleology that provides meaning.
Yes,
which is in essence like a religion, and if you do attack the philosophical view, you're almost attacking the.
I think that's very plausible. As you say, there are many versions and so many idealists, and so it's difficult to generalize. But yes,
It's very. For all those listening and watching, I'm sorry if I sound like I generalized.
No, I think it's I guess I've never really felt the need for that, or even if there was some objective purpose, we would still be able to stand back and say, well, so what? So this objective purpose has been established, but do I have to run along these rails that have been established? I suppose in that respect, I have maybe existentialist tendencies. I
think on the flip side, the one good thing about most idealist theories is that they often do preach very positive behaviors. It's not that the alternatives are negative in essence. It's more that the alternatives do not preach it as much. So there is that element of one does talk about it a lot more. The other is not negative inherently, but they just don't go out there and give you this sort of moral grounding and purpose actively, let's say.
Yes.
Am I articulating that correctly? Do you feel like
I'm not sure. For one thing, I mean, if we're talking about frameworks for doing consciousness science, then it doesn't seem terribly relevant. I mean, you would hope that reality is fairly benign, but I don't.
I mean, I can empathize with the idealist view in so much as the aspect of reality that we just don't understand. So, and that's as far as I can go. And other than that, all I can do is explore the ideas. But then there's also the panpsychist view, which we have to consider. And I wanted to ask you, what were your thoughts when Dennett and the group of scientists, philosophers all signed for the IIT's non-scientific approach to their work? Do you remember the infamous dilemma?
Oh yes, I signed it.
Yes, I think I remember that.
And I've written a paper actually.
How did
following up on that?
How did Philip feel about that? Were you guys able to have a Mindshare episode without having a little bit of animosity? Well, it's not technically going against Philip. It's more.
I'm not sure Philip is. I think he's sympathetic to IIT. I'm not sure he's. My take is that IIT is a metaphysical theory that's dressed up with maths, and to that extent is not regular science, because it starts with a bunch of a priori intuitions, axioms that are just derived from introspection. Now, if you think that consciousness is something irreducibly subjective, that there really is this essentially private world, that's what we're trying to do science on, then that will be a reasonable way to start. There'd be no point in trying to define it in third person terms, in terms of whatever how do you define memory, for instance? Well, it's whatever processes are involved in being able to recall information about the past or whatever, and make reliable reports about the past. You can give us some kind of operational definition, I suppose, definition in functional terms, and you can do it with all psychological faculties. And then you can say, okay, what are the mechanisms involved in producing these effects? Now, if you think that consciousness can't be defined in that way, or that the essential heart of consciousness can't, that it's irreducibly subjective, that it can't be captured in third person terms, then you're going to have to approach it by, your direct first person acquaintance with it, and you're going to have to start with some principles that seem to you intuitively obvious. And then you elaborate it, and you derive postulates about the physical correlates of the physical basis of these things, and then you start doing all this elaborate maths. Well, yeah, but that started with a metaphysical assumption about the irreducibly subjective nature of consciousness. And to that extent, it starts with a metaphysical assumption that no other science starts with.
Yeah.
And all the rest of science assumes it's just one reality which can be investigated by third person means. Okay, somebody's going to say quantum physics, but let's leave that out for a moment. So it's at least anomalous science, and it's anomalous because it begins with a metaphysical presumption that no other area of science has. And if you think, as I do, that the metaphysical assumption is deeply flawed, then you're going to say, well, it's not really science. It's not. So, yeah. But then I would say the same of all science that's predicated on that same metaphysical assumption. It's just a bizarre way of doing science, that you start with a bunch of things that seem to you intuitively true about it and treat them as axioms, and then start looking for objective features that might provide the physical basis for whatever it is that is described by those axioms. It's no other area. We don't start with saying, look, the sun is the thing that moves through the sky. Now, what must the rest of reality be like for that to be true? We don't do it that way. Any observations can be corrected in the light of wider theorizing. So if you start with some introspective observations, if you like, though they're not thought of in that way, and treat them as axioms that define the shape of the whole project, then that's a different way. That's not the way that the rest of science is done. So it's the very least anomalous.
And I think that at that point, then obviously that would apply to many quantum theories of consciousness, and you would sort of have a similar approach.
Yeah, because
on Twitter, at least, Stuart's very active on Twitter. Hammeroff, he goes at it with people.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all issues about computability that seem to me pretty much irrelevant to the things, to the hard problem, because they're about proofs and so on. Which, and also, the idea that observation plays some role, without specifying what you mean by the observing subject and giving some account of that, and on which what's the metaphysical state of the observing subject? Is it just the animal? Is that, the whole cognitive system? What's the observing subject that can I don't understand how this works out. I don't see how you can get features of an immensely complex system such as human being you can get explanations that sort of start at the level with the fundamental concepts of basic physics, but then somehow introduce elements from extraordinarily from a special science of extraordinarily complex physical beings, namely psychology. I just don't see how you can get these into the same explanatory discourse.
Well, Keith, in terms of, from an illusionist perspective, is there anything about illusionism as a theory of consciousness, illusionism according to how you define it, and not to people thinking that consciousness doesn't exist, that you feel that you haven't yet touched on, or that you'd like to reiterate, because it's often going to be misunderstandings?
Well, look, illusionism is it's a label for a way of looking at the issues, and a way of it's a label for, if you like, a program, a bunch of questions to be asked. Okay, and it's a rejection of certain questions and an introduction of or promotion of certain other questions in their place. Now, what answers you give to those questions, the questions that illusionism poses or asks you to focus on, I mean, there's going to be that is consciousness science as far as I'm concerned. That's there's so much to do then, so much that we don't know, so many possibilities, so many theoretical possibilities, and I'm just sort of waving my hands around a bit. I mean, there's people who are doing much more detailed work in that. So my main aim is to stop people obsessing over questions, stop people going down a road that's leading to a dead end, and get them to go down the road that opens up into many, many, many more fruitful roads. So again, it's the stopping the bad approach and promoting the good approach. So I think there's a certain amount of compromise I can do with people who say, look, we can't give up this approach. We can't, because it's just what we're most certain of. It's what's most important. It's the heart of the matter. It's what we're trying to, that's what's need explaining. And you mustn't tell us to stop asking those questions, because those are the questions, perhaps the only really, really important questions idealists would say. Well, I can do a certain amount of negotiation with them. I can say, look, there's a question I'm asking that kind of does the same work as that pretty much. Just as in case of free will, you can say, well, we shouldn't talk about absolutely unconstrained free will, but we can talk about autonomy and self-control and the mechanisms that support that. And that really does all the work that you think you're doing with that concept. In fact, it does it better and more effectively. And so I can say, look, I hear what you're saying. I hear there's something there that needs explaining. But come with me over here and I'll show you that I can give you most of what you want. In fact, something a little bit different from what you thought you wanted, but that does the work that you wanted, and in fact does a lot of other work too. And the bits that it can't do don't really need doing anyway. All the free will worth wanting, as Stan says, all the consciousness worth wanting I can give you. I can't give you a sort of, maybe a sort of consciousness that you want that just escapes the physical, I was going to say nexus, but I'm not sure that's the word, that escapes the physical world. But if so, that wouldn't be worth wanting because it wouldn't matter in the physical world, and we live in a physical world. So I can give you most of what you want, and I can give you a bit more, and I can show you that the bits that I can't give you, you don't really need anyway. So I'm willing to do that sort of thing. So I'm willing to bring people across, and even to perhaps use some of the terminology that they want to use if it's really important to them, with a certain sort of adding a star or a prime or something to it to indicate. I'm willing to do all that. But they have to meet me, they have to be willing to come over and have a look. If they just insist on banging the table that they've already got it nailed down, that the conception they have is already perfectly accurate, that this is revealed to them just in some primitive way, in some fundamental way, it's revealed to them, whoever they are, then I can't do anything. All I can do is say, there's another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And if you're ever willing to try and exploit, I'll be there.
Illusionism is an intuition pump for consciousness, in a sense. It's a massive one.
It's a deliberately provocative. I think the term has its value. I think I can defend the use of it. It's a term that Dan used a lot, and that matters to me because he's my my compass in all of this.
Dan wrote a paper called "Illusionism as the Default Theory of Consciousness."
Yes, I know. Proud that he wrote that, and but it is a provocative word. It's and if it offends people, then I'm. I don't mean to offend them. I mean to shock them a little, or at least alert them to shake them out of the complacency a little bit. I do mean to do that. I do mean to shake your complacency.
It's strategic. It's a good word. It's not necessarily badly chosen, because you want a word that actually elicits a response. You can't just have some sort of
absolutely. But once I've shaken you up, then maybe I can restore do a little bit to settle you down again. And I think that's probably one. Nick's word surrealism is quite nice, though it does suggest. I don't know. I don't like the fact that Nick does continue to use words like phenomenal properties. I don't like that, but surrealism isn't bad. But it's
Well, so illusionism is more of an intuition pump to help you escape Descartes' prison.
It's not really even a pump, because it's just a word, but it's it's a bit of rhetoric maybe
in itself. I mean, if you take the word with its meaning, it can become a sort of an intuition pump.
Yeah, and the metaphor for me was always, it wasn't people being stupidly taken in by some trick. It was people going to the theatre and seeing. I love illusions. I absolutely love illusions. It's people going to the theatre and seeing a wonderfully crafted piece of stage magic, which they know is an illusion. They're not under any. They don't think that this guy's really levitating or something, but they're enraptured by it. It has a wonderful uplifting effect. I mean, it's wonderful, and I think that the if you like, what the brain does. This is coming back to Nick's perspective on this. I think that this illusion. It's wonderful what the brain, it's this sense of ourselves and of our immediate presence in the world as a little locus of meaning and agency. And that's wonderful story that we're crafting about ourselves. And the effect is fantastic. I mean, illusion isn't a derogatory term. poetry is an illusion, if you like. Again, or at least an exaggeration, a distortion of reality, but for expressive purposes. And that's what I think that phenomenal talks do. It's distortion of reality for expressive purposes. Again, getting close to Nick again, it's surrealism. So surrealism's not a bad term.
Look, Nick's also he's an excellent thinker, and I think
the
fact that you guys are still on the same page, slightly just terminologies are just changing a little bit here and there. It says a lot as well.
I think, I mean, the way I want to see, well, I love what Nick's doing. I think he's, alongside Dan, he's been a major influence on me. And I see what we're doing as, I don't know if he would agree with this, but we're essentially doing the same thing. And we're sort of, we've got different, I think perhaps we're addressing different audiences, possibly, slightly. And we're also got different techniques. But we're operating in collaboration. I think we're sort of advertising the same product, but in different ways, if you like.
I mean, it's just like
strategies.
Just like the edition you published all those years ago. When was it? 2018, I think. It was. I mean, Blackmore, Humphrey, you, Dennett, Graziano, Boom, Kammerer. You know, it's all you guys just doing the same thing, and just a little different here and there.
Yeah, and it's something, of course, that it's not something completely new. This is another thing I've been exploring a little bit recently, is the history of this. Although the name is relatively recent, the position's been around for quite a long time. I mean, you have people like, oh my goodness me, I've forgotten his name like that. Dear me, my brain is not
it's fine
working. I can't remember them, but there'll be people talking in, it's very much the same. Brian Farrell, 1950 paper in Mind called Experience, which is thoroughgoing illusionism without it might even use the term illusion at some point, I think. Thoroughgoing, absolutely going, influence on Dennett. Brian Farrell, excellent paper, 1950, Mind, everyone should read it. So there's quite a long history of as soon as people started articulating physicalist views, this has been an option. And so the real advantage of having the term is to collect these closely related positions under a collective term, so that their similarities can be emphasized and the different options explored.
Last time we spoke, we mentioned someone else. We mentioned even Darren Brown. I'm also, it's after speaking for almost 2 hours, 2 hours plus. Yes. This tends to happen, but it's fine. Darren Brown, I would love to have him on this podcast at some point. It would be amazing to chat to Darren Brown about the mind.
I would love to. I mean, I called my blog Tricks of the Mind, which is a I didn't actually borrow it, I think, from him, unless unconsciously, but I realized that he'd written a book with the same name. I'd love to know what his views on this.
I've read that book, actually, and he's been someone I've always looked up to in terms of the way he uses psychology to...
He did this wonderful thing, which traditional magicians had presented magical effects, tricks, as supernatural.
Yes, and he did the opposite.
He did this really clever thing. He presented tricks of, I suspect often very similar tricks, as not as supernatural, but as super psychology. Yes. And a lot of people thought that he was using real psychological techniques that they could perhaps learn, so they could get this super psychology too, and maybe sort of hypnotize people and convince people to do things.
Programming.
But that was just part of the trick. There was no super psychology. I mean, I'm sure he's very smart and very good at dealing with people. He's a performer, but the tricks, I think, are just basically standard mentalism and stuff like that. But presented in this fantastic way for a modern audience as bits of super psychology. And so I'd love to know what he thinks about the brain's own trickery that it performs on itself. It would be interesting to know if his perspective as someone who knows how effects are created.
Exactly. I would love, if anyone knows Darren Brown, anyone listening or watching, send us his email address. We need to dissect.
I would love to do it. I assume he's very busy, and
yeah, me too.
It's very.
I've reached out once. I haven't had a response. So
I do know someone who knows him, but I suspect his time is too precious to.
We've got to do it at some point. We need to do it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Unlike most academics, people will pay for his time, whereas we do it. We talk for vanity's sake.
Yeah,
he doesn't need the boost to his self-esteem that comes from being interviewed.
Unless he really enjoys the academic discourse. You never know. Some of these people really are intrigued. He's one of them, though.
It will be very interesting to have the perspective of someone who knows how these effects are created, to look at some of the things people say about the effects, to look at introspective reports. They know how perceptual reports can be manipulated. They know how people can be got to report seeing or not seeing things that were actually there, that were either there in front of them or not there in front of them. How you can manipulate people's perceptual judgments. I wonder if they have any insights into how you can manipulate people's introspective judgments.
Yeah, I think you would be an awesome person to.
That would be a fantastic question to ask. Certainly, if you take the parallel. I mean, here's. Oh, sorry, I'm getting tired, so I'm just free associating now. But it's interesting that the people really resist the idea of introspective illusion. But look, suppose just take a naturalistic perspective. If introspection is an evolved mental faculty, just like various forms of perception, why wouldn't it be just as liable to illusion, misrepresentation as the various perceptual capacities are? We all accept that perceptual capacities are subject to misrepresentation, illusion, distortion. Why wouldn't introspection be the same? Yeah. And I think pulling at the back of all of this, then it talked about Cartesian gravity. I think pulling at the back of all this, there's the Cartesian sun, which is substance dualism. And I think that's what's exerting this pull, the idea that really I am not something. I am not just my brain. And my awareness is not just my brain being sensitive to features of the world around it and reacting to them. There's something, some other, there's something happening on another plane, as it were. And of course, you won't find many people who would actually endorse that strong form of substance dualism, but I think it's exerting a pull in the background. And so you're having, Dennett talked about Cartesian materialism, which was people who were thoroughly going materialist and saying, no, it's just the brain doing stuff, but they still tried to conceptualize it in a way that retained some of those intuitions that were true on the dualist view. So this idea of direct acquaintance with mental qualities, the idea that you have this infallible knowledge of what it's like to be you, at least when you're paying attention and using the right concepts. That's something that doesn't really make sense within a thoroughgoing naturalistic perspective, where what you've got here are evolved representational mechanisms. But it does make sense, I suppose, if you've got an immaterial soul that is simple and sort of knows its own states just in some fundamental way. So I think there's this pull of the Cartesian sun there.
Substance dualism. I've noticed nowadays there's also a lot of dual aspect monists. This seems to be also quite a new growing philosophy.
Yes, well, it's just that is just a way of again, it's a way of hanging on to key Cartesian intuitions. The nice thing about dual aspect stuff is that you don't actually have to mess with unless these things have emergent causal powers, you don't have to actually mess with the physics. There's no, or any other aspects of science. You don't expect these things to show up in any way. But then, of course, if they don't show up, then how are you even aware of them? If they're not making some difference to what's happening in your brain, how are you aware of them? If you are just an embodied, if you are just an embodied brain, I mean, if if that's all you are, then if the things aren't making any distinctive changes to the state of your nervous system, then you won't be aware of them. And you could say, well, yes, but they're sort of aware of themselves. Well, you know, this brain state has an intrinsic nature. It's like something for the brain state. It likes for the brain state. Lovely. The brain state is like something. The neural correlates are like something. Lovely. What about me? I'm not the brain state. I'm the whole organism. How do I get to know about what my brain state's like? Unless there's something else in my brain that's sensitive to the intrinsic nature of that brain state and then produces certain distinctive effects and tells me about that, and so that I can report them. I mean, my whole body could be infused with a kind of intrinsic, wonderful intrinsic quality, but if there's nothing tracking that, no mechanisms tracking that and producing appropriate psychological effects, then it's nothing to me. My body could be infused with radiation or something, and it wouldn't, unless it's having some effects. What happens next, as Dan said?
You mentioned you are compatibilist with free will. Is it similar to Dan's position? And what are your thoughts on someone like Dirk Pierboom's and Greg Russo's approach?
Oh, now that's a tricky question because I haven't written a lot.
It's more of the hard incompatibilism. I mean, obviously Dirk was part of your consciousness paper. I think he was, eh?
Yes, he was, but he was writing about the he's
different topic.
In his 2012 book, he considers not under the name Illusionism, but he considers it as an option alongside Russellian monism as another option. He doesn't commit to either of them, but he articulates a version of Illusionism as a theoretical possibility very clearly. Free will, I've never felt this, again, it's a Cartesian intuition that I have to be something that escapes this causal web in order to be able to be really active and responsible. And that only seems to be that worry only gets a grip if, sorry, let me say it again. It's that I have to escape the causal web if I'm to be genuinely active and morally responsible. But that assumes that I'm not already part of that causal web. If I am just a certain portion of all that causal activity, that is what I am. I am just a certain complex of processes within a wider network of causality. Then I'm having an effect and can be held responsible in virtue of the causal processes that constitute me. I don't need to be disrupting those causal. In fact, I couldn't, because they are what make me. Those are my actions, my decisions, are those particular causal processes that are basically centered on this fleshy ball thing here. Okay, so it's only if you think of yourself as something separate from all that that you're going to need to have the freedom to intervene in it. If you think all this stuff's going on here, and this brain and this fleshy thing is doing its stuff, but I'm not really having a say in it, that's because you're thinking of yourself as something distinct. You've got this Cartesian intuition that you're something distinct, and therefore you need to somehow push around stuff inside here. So I just completely reject that. Another idea is, I suppose, that if everything's were causally determined, then the outcome would already be settled. Well, I don't really, I mean, that doesn't seem a consideration that remotely enters into my thinking about my activity in the world. Maybe the future, I mean, you get exactly, you don't need to be a determinist to have this worry. You can have it if you think that God already knows the future. If you think that there are facts about the future facts. So you can have that perfectly the same worry from a theological perspective. If God already knows the future's settled, there's only going to be one course it's going to go down. And indeed, only one thing is actually going to happen on any view. And you can't, given that a certain thing is going to happen, you can't do anything to make it not happen. But then why would you want to have that sort of power in order to be able to do the things you're doing? That's not stopping you doing anything. It's not confronting you as an obstacle in some way. You can only do the things that you're equipped and sort of wound up to do as in your particular but what has gone into putting you in this position where you are going to act in certain ways is a hugely complex history of fine-tuning and exploration and adjustment and self reflection and self manipulation and so on, and it's put you in this position where that is the thing you'll do next, and that's an authentic expression of you. So what do you want? I mean, it's wanting to be a little god who can be an uncaused cause, and well, I don't even think that would be that's not even a particularly coherent thing to want to be. I mean, how would you make your decisions if you had this sort of completely again, I think it's an illusion that, I mean, I suppose one of the reason is that we just don't know we're not aware of where our decisions come to. They seem spontaneous because we don't know their etiology. We don't know their springs of action are hidden from us, or we can explore them a bit, but there's always going to be further stuff that we can't explore. So it seems spontaneous to us, and provided it's not constrained in unnatural ways, what more do you want? I think once you reconcile yourself to being the kind of being you actually are, you see that, again, as Dan says, you have all the free will worth wanting, you have all the consciousness worth wanting, you have all the meaning and the purpose worth wanting. It doesn't need to be validated on some separate metaphysical plane.
It's so,
and after all, the things that you want to be validated are all, the moral intuitions that you want to be validated, the purposes that you want to be imprinted in the universe are ones that come from our nature anyway. I mean, the purposes that a lion would want to see implemented in the universe, or that a spider or a virus or heaven knows what sort of alien would want to see imprinted on the nature of the universe, are totally different from the ones that we want to, that we cuddly, sociable, argumentative apes do.
Keith, I don't think you realize this, but that photograph of Dan behind you, the way it's almost like he's looking at you, smiling at talking. It's so amazing. It really is.
It was taken here in Crete in 2018. It's a nice photo, isn't it?
Yes, and the position. I mean, you must put it back in that spot, eh? Do not move it from that spot, because it's as if he's looking at you, smiling as you talk, so proudly of him. And that's what actually got us to have the second conversation. It was your tweet about I think you did a lecture on Dan, just a tribute to him. And for that,
I did a lecture on the hard problem, and then I used the second part to try and set out what I'm provisionally calling reactivity schema theory.
If the provisional title changes, what do you think you would opt for?
There's something about reactivity, but possibly calling reactivity schema. The idea of schema is perhaps too specific. It suggests just a simplified version rather than a distorted version. It also suggests something that might be a rival or an add-on to Graziano's, which is not. Well, it's not a rival, certainly, but it might be an add-on. But I maybe want to. It's more of again, I'm not in the business of constructing detailed scientific theories. I'm in the business of suggesting avenues for exploration. Yes. And so I maybe want something that's a little bit more open, that says these are the sort of. I love interacting with scientists, but I'm not doing. I'm setting out questions for scientific exploration. So maybe I want something a little more open. But if you have any ideas, let me know.
Keith, thank you. First of all, this was such a wonderful conversation. It's been a few years in the making, which is a bit too long. So I think our next round will come very soon. Any final words from your side?
Yes, let's. But first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you. You have a fantastic podcast. I'm honored to have been one of the first guests, and it's great to be back. It's great to talk to you as always, because although I tend to talk too much, we do have there's a real conversation going on where I feel that I'm learning from you as well as hopefully giving you something to think about. So it's a pleasure to talk, and let's do it again soon, especially given this rather alarming mention of Mysterianism. So I think it's been too long, and we need to.
I think I should change. I don't actually want to be in that label. I'd rather just say I'm just unsure at the moment.
But
I'm open to convincing anytime.
Doubt is always good. You've been one of the most responsive and open-minded people I've discussed this with. You see, you get what's going on. Dan used to say this thing sometimes. He would say, "You get it," and it was a big compliment. It meant you tuned into the right wavelength. You get it. And I feel you get it, and so that's what makes for a productive conversation. Even if you don't endorse it, yes, at least getting it, getting the idea, getting the attraction. I think some people think I'm just being awkward or difficult or contrary, or maybe that I am not myself conscious, and that can be a little frustrating.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
So having a productive conversation with someone who gets it is always interesting. So,
and as I said, my intuitions are still very much the same as they were 3 years ago. Just a little bit more open-minded in a sense, but yeah, very much still. I do understand exactly what you mean when you say you have to backtrack, you have to sort of defend, and I see exactly why, where, and when you have to do it. And
it's very difficult because with some audiences you need to sort of go on the attack, and others you need to defend. It's difficult to pitch it. Whichever way I pitch it, somebody's not going to like it pitched at that level. It's not going to work. And of course, you said about mysteries. I think all questions, all explanations are relative to some sort of framework. And the bigger you make the question, eventually you run out of frameworks within which they can be answered. So if you're asking, why is there something rather than nothing? There's no framework within which that question can be answered, I don't think. It's just make the question. And we have this amazing capacity to ask more and more general questions. And of course, you're going to get to some point where there's no framework for answering them. Now, my point about consciousness is that doesn't take us to that point where it's an ultimate mystery. That there are going to be questions that are just beyond our ability to frame any explanatory framework, but consciousness doesn't pose one of those. That's what I want to say.
I think that for me, the more I'm learning about this, the more I know about it, the less I feel like I know anything about this. And I think it's a good way to live life in general, because that's often the case, especially with the Dunning-Kruger effect. I mean, the more you really start to delve into a subject, the more you realize there's way more to it that you really need to go.
It's a balancing act. I think humility is definitely good, definitely. And I wouldn't want people to think that I'm just happy that I've sorted it out.
Yes.
Like that. But you have to strike a balance in that if you're going to argue for anything, if you're going to I see what I'm putting forward a perspective. I'm saying, look at this angle. I think it's interesting. I think it's fruitful. I think this could be the way to go. Come and have a look, see what you think. But I'm not going to settle it. Whether I'm convinced or not doesn't really matter in the slightest. It's a question of whether these roads are going to prove fruitful.
Yeah.
Whether we're going to find things going down.
And we need people like you to be doing that, because then I cannot have these conversations, because you guys are the ones putting out the work that I'm talking about. I'm merely just joining in and enjoying.
I think you're doing a bit more than that, actually. I think you're underselling yourself a bit there, but you're certainly helping us to communicate.
I appreciate that, Keith. Thank you so much once again. I really appreciate your time. You keep up the excellent work. Always enjoy it.
You too.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm looking forward to, we have a scheduled lecture that you're going to give us soon, and I'll definitely let everyone know once we get that done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Tevin. Great talking to you again.
Thank you so much, Keith.